Tom Oliver, if he would come and just greet us for a moment.
Well, we're delighted to have you joining us in Hall County today. I think the ones that are regulars to this community will find out we're a great place to live and work and invest your money. We're excited. We're excited about what Virgil Williams and his team is doing for our community in the islands here. And we're also pretty well excited about our delegation. We think they have come a long ways. Representative Mills has done a great job for us there, and Carl Rogers does a great job. And I'd like to say a little bit about James. James and I, you can tell, have a little different physique, as you can tell, okay? Well, let me tell you, he has a son, Micah, isn't that right, James? Mm-hmm. Who's a starting middle linebacker for our local high school team. And I think that's quite an accomplishment for anybody that's playing football today. They've got a lot of potential. That team has come a long ways. I won't tell you the record right now, but I think the end of the season will be a pleasant surprise. But I'd like to welcome you to our community and thank you for being here, and look forward to any way we can help you as Hall County. We're open for business. And once again, thanks again. Thanks, James.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. You ought to run for office. It's great. Appreciate it. There'll be a slideshow presentation of my son's football feats afterward. Thank you, Tom. We are glad to have you here in Hall County, and there are a lot of great things going on here in this exact location. But we're here today to conduct our next scheduled meeting of the Comprehensive Tax Reform Study Committee meeting. And we'll be having another meeting following this, and looking forward to that. That'll, I believe, will be chaired by Representative Chuck Martin. If we could, I'll just ask all of the members, if they would, just to remember that the mics are live, and if you would just share one. As we go down the line here, I'd like to ask our esteemed chairman, if you would just to introduce yourself and tell the folks what area you represent.
Hello, everybody. I'm Larry O'Neill from the Middle Georgia District of 146 in Houston County. And I think you were trying to tell me the mic was live because I was chewing that thing. I'm sorry. Welcome, everybody. We're glad to be with you.
Richard Royal. I'm from District 171. It's Colquitt, Mitchell County in southwest Georgia.
Good afternoon. I'm Butch Parrish. I live down in Swainsboro, represent District 156. That's Johnson, Emmanuel, Candler, and part of Bullitt County. I'm glad to be with you.
And good evening. My name is David Knight. I'm the representative from District 126, and that is parts of Spalding, Butts, and Lamar County, about an hour below Atlanta.
Good afternoon. My name is Chuck Martin. I represent the 47th District, which is made up of Greater North Fulton County, Alpharetta and Roswell, and soon to be the cities of Johns Creek and Milton. I appreciate you guys taking the time to be here with us today, and we look forward to what you have to say.
All right, as you can tell, we have a full agenda today, and we're going to try to keep things hopping and moving right along. And our first person on the agenda, our first presenter, if we would just ask the presenters if you would to step forward and stand behind the podium here, and remember that you're addressing the members as well as the folks in the audience. If you need a PowerPoint presentation, Ward Lamb, to my right, your left, behind us here, we'll be glad to help you get set up and you can plug in. It would help us if we keep things moving. If you have a presentation that you need to do, if you'll get that prepared so that we can just move right along. And we'll get started. Our first presentation comes from Dr. Carolyn Bordeaux, who's Assistant Professor of Public Administration and Urban Studies at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University. And we'll call on Dr. Bordeaux at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, so I'm going to roll this without the PowerPoints because I know you guys don't have much time, but we'll be coming out with a brief report on budget reserves through the Fiscal Research Center. And I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights, and I'm happy to answer questions later if you have any. Right now, the way the Georgia State Code stands, the state has to establish and maintain a revenue shortfall reserve in an amount equal to 4% of the net revenues from the previous year. This amount is capped at 10% of the previous year's net revenue. There should be, yeah, you've got my PowerPoint slides. Okay. What I did to look at this reserve was to first compare it to other states that have AAA bond ratings, and then to look at the previous downturns that the state faced and how much it would need to have on reserve in order to keep revenues level. Okay, so perhaps the most conservative way of looking at it, assuming that there is no increase, you all didn't project any kind of increase in your revenues or expenditures for the coming year. Just to flip through it, in the comparison to other states, I looked at Delaware, Maryland, Minnesota, Missouri, Virginia, Utah, and compared all of them. They have on average about a 5% reserve set aside. A state like Virginia have a 10% cap, very similar to Georgia. A couple states have a cap of 5% on their revenue shortfall reserve. Georgia is basically right in keeping with those other states in terms of its policy. Right now it's a little bit low in terms of what it actually has on hand, but I understand that in fiscal year 06, a good chunk of money will be put into the revenue shortfall reserve. I also looked at some of the recommended best practices. The Government Finance Officers Association recommends between 5 and 15% of net revenues on reserve. National Conference of State Legislators, 5% of net expenditures. And a lot of research supports the idea that sort of between 5 and 15% is about what you need to cover you for that first shock that you're likely to face if something goes awry in the economy. Unfortunately, to cover to keep things level for more than 1 year, you often need between like 10 and 50% of your net revenues to keep expenditures and revenues level over a couple years, which is beyond what most states are willing to hold. Looking at the two big downturns that the state has faced over the past 20 years, really, you have one in 1991, 92, and then you have one in 2002, 2003, which is the really big one that the state just came through. Looking at the downturn in 91, 92, you had revenues decrease by 2% and then by 1% in each year in real dollars. Assuming that the state in 1991 had not projected any growth, okay, so they didn't go out there and spend budget based on a projected increase in revenues, the state would have needed a 6% reserve based on 1990 net revenues. They would have needed to set aside 6% in order to keep revenues flat. Okay? If they had projected an increase, say 6%, which is the historic average increase in Georgia, they would have needed to have had about a 20% reserve on hand. Okay? So when I'm talking about flat, I'm keeping it at a very conservative and perhaps even unlikely low number. In 2002 and 03, of course, this was a tremendous downturn. A lot of other states compared it to the worst downturn since World War II. Revenues decreased by 7% in 2002, 7% again in 2003 in real dollars. Okay, so I'm taking into account inflation there. It also turned down in actual dollars, as many of you know. In order to keep revenues constant, expenditures constant for 02, the state would have needed an 8% reserve in 2001 net revenues. Fortuitously, the state did have that on hand. Over the entire 02-05 period, the state would have needed about 45% of net revenues in order to keep everything flat. In 2001, the state had reserves, and it had a substantial surplus on hand, equal to about 12% of net revenues. What this did meant that in 2002, you probably didn't feel this sudden downturn very dramatically, and then in 2003, the state had a softer landing than it might have otherwise, even though it did have to make some pretty significant cuts. Interestingly, in real terms, the state has not recovered entirely. In real dollars, the state is still, I believe as of 2005, is still below 2001 in terms of real net revenues coming in. One other thing that I looked at, just in brief, was cash flow and the extent to which the state needs to have some sort of buffer on hand during the year as the revenues fluctuate throughout the year. In general, Georgia has always been fairly good in terms of having sufficient cash on hand. Unlike a lot of other states, it has not had to issue tax anticipation notes. So it seems like the state is fairly safe with regard to having enough of a buffer during the fiscal year. In general, Georgia's policy seems to be in line with other states, slightly lower, and generally it's in line with the existing best practices. In terms of its policy, it would need to refill its revenue shortfall reserve sum in order to keep up with other states that are AAA bond rated. And one thing it might want to consider in order to really be in line with something like a Government Finance Officers Association recommendation is setting a 5% minimum, and then the 10% maximum seems to be okay. That's it? You're not doing questions or?
Well, Dr. Badeau, thank you for that presentation. Any members have any questions that you'd like to ask? The reserve is a very important subject, so any questions from any members? All right, Dr.
Okay.
Badeau, you did very well. Thank you.
Kept it short. Thanks a lot.
At this time, our next presenter will be Dr. Sally Wallace, who's Professor of Economics and Associate Director at the Fiscal Research Center, the Andrew Young Policy Studies at Georgia State University. And if you have a handout, it will help us, if you're a presenter, if you'll let us know your handout, the title, maybe hold it up so we can see. We have a number here, and that'll help us to refer to it as you speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us. The handout that I'm going to speak to has a title of Number of Local Governments and Sales Tax Exemptions, titled by Dave Showquist and myself. What I was charged to do with today are two things. First, to sort of very briefly talk about the number of local governments in Georgia. I understand that a question or an issue came up at one of the previous meetings regarding whether or not, if Georgia consolidated the number of local governments, whether that would be any saving in terms of expenditures in the public sector. And then secondly, sort of disjointly, the issue of sales tax exemptions, which was flashed very nicely on the front cover of AJC this morning. So first I'll talk briefly about the issue of the number of local governments. Georgia is popularly known to be one of the states with the most number of county governments. Georgia, with 159 counties, is a fairly large number across states. Texas is the only state with more county governments at 254. Delaware, the small state of Delaware, has 3 counties, so those are the extremes there. As you all certainly know, those absolute comparisons are not all that useful without taking into consideration what different local governments do, the size of states, the area that are covered by states. So what we did, and goes to the 3rd page of the PowerPoint, table number 1 looks at the number of local governments along a couple of different strata. And when we look at overall local governments, not just counties, but overall local governments, Georgia posts 1,047 local governments, which ranks at 21st among the 50 states. So no longer at the high end of the spectrum, but sort of right in the middle of the range of what states do for local government. Illinois has nearly 5 times as many local governments. It has a total of 4,692, and Hawaii has the smallest number of local governments with 6 local governments. Again, comparing pure numbers, absolute numbers like that is a little bit of apples and orange comparison. So we took, in the next 3 slides where you'll see the graphs, we looked at the number of local governments relative to some other demographics, which is the population size and also the land area. Georgia ranks 37 in terms of the number of local governments. If we look at local governments per 100,000 of the population, so we're at the lower end when we sort of control for the size of our population. And we rank 28th in terms of number of local governments when we do it by square miles, per 1,000 square miles. The big question, the policy question that came to us was whether or not the number of local governments had much correlation with the level of expenditures. So the graphs on page 4, 5, and 6 in the handout are very simple correlations of the number of local governments and the expenditures per capita for all states. And if you just look at those graphs, what we if we thought that there was a relationship, we should see a very strong line either up an angle or down an angle. And what we noticed, and when we look statistically, is that there's not a significant relationship between the number of local governments and the expenditures per capita when we control for population size or land area. What does that mean? Does it mean that there is any relationship between local government spending and the number of local governments? Really difficult to ascertain from the evidence that we see. Large part of the problem is that each state and each local government presents a different market basket to their constituents. So you have the apples and oranges problem where local governments are producing different types of public goods. The evidence, empirical evidence that's been done is strongest for school districts, in part because they provide something that's a little bit more homogeneous, more similar. And the empirical evidence does seem pretty strong to say that the cost, sort of the economies of scale for school systems comes at school system sizes of between 2,000 and 4,000 students. So school systems that are quite a bit smaller than that and school systems that are larger than that are hitting the diseconomies of scale. 2,000 to 4,000 numbers of students per school system seems to be empirically kind of the optimal in terms of government expenditures on schools. In Georgia, we have, we counted up 50 systems with less than 2,000 students and 12 systems with less than 1,000 students. So we do have a number of school systems that are in the lower end of that range. And we do also have some school systems above or close to 4,000, particularly in the metro area of Gwinnett County. So, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, I'll jump to the sales tax.
That'd be great.
The remainder of the presentation is on sales tax expenditures. As we all know, sales tax is one of our largest revenue producers, both for the state government and for local governments in Georgia. In fiscal year 05, it brought in for the state $5.2 billion of revenue, making it one of the top producers. 34.3% of total state government tax revenue came in the way of sales tax. Georgia, like many states, has a number of exemptions in the sales tax system. Georgia's tax code is written both specifically and generally. Retail goods, sales at retail are typically taxed unless specifically exempted. Services in the Georgia code are typically exempted unless specifically taxed. So we have slight difference in the language for retail consumption versus service kinds of consumption. The sales tax exemptions in Georgia, as well as other states, are made for many different reasons. They're made for equity reasons, for charity purposes, nonprofit corporate companies, for purposes of economic development. Some examples include food, prescription drugs, sales tax exemptions for particular industries. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy on the pros and cons of exemptions. On the positive side, they're thought to bring in an aspect of equity, for instance, with the food exemption, or they may help economic development. On the other hand, they can be difficult to deal with in terms of tax administration. Sometimes we're left with smaller companies making the decision, making sure that they catch what's tax exempt and what's not tax exempt. In Georgia, the sales tax exemptions have grown over time, and currently the foregone revenue value of the sales tax exemption, this is in FY04 numbers that we did, is $9.8 billion. So if we wiped out every sales tax exemption, the good ones and the bad ones, it would increase sales tax revenue in 2004 by $9.8 billion. So in 2004, again, if we had wiped out all of those exemptions, sales tax revenue would have been $14.7 billion. More than double, obviously, what we currently have. Now, if we wanted to wipe out those exemptions but keep our sales tax and not raise any more revenue, so keep revenue neutral, that would suggest that we could lower the state sales tax rate from 4% to 1.33%. So for the trade-off there that we might do. In the report to the committee, Ward also handed out a recent report that documents the sales tax. I'm not going to go through, but there's a Table 1 in the report that begins on page 3, and it documents the revenue loss from each individual sales tax exemption. And just to highlight for everyone, the largest exemptions are for food, the credit allowance for trade-ins, vehicle trade-ins and others, prescription drugs, repair services, government sales, sales of raw material used in manufacturing. Those are very large tax expenditures. Some of the very specific tax expenditures that are in this estimate include the sales tax holiday, the sales tax exemption for the film production and digital broadcasting industry, and sodgrass. And I just picked those out as examples of some that are in this table. With respect to the sales tax exemptions, again, there are justifications for many of them. In order to remain competitive, to be equitable, many of them have positive justifications. One of the biggest issues to consider or to worry about is whether those continue to be relevant in today's economy and what the implications are for tax administration by having these exemptions in the system. That's the end of my remarks, and I'm happy to respond to questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Any questions from members of the committee? Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand. Your numbers indicate that in '04, I guess it is, or '05, that if we had no exemptions in our code, we would have collected 2 times again what we did.
Close to 2 times as much.
So with no exemptions, our revenues from sales tax then would be about 15
billion.
And that was for '05.
'04. FY '04.
Okay. Now, are you pretty sure about those numbers?
But we think that they're done to the best of the ability for the numbers that we can estimate. You'll notice in the table that some of them we don't think that we have good numbers for, so those are not in the bottom line. So in Table 1, there's some that we don't have estimates for. So we're I think in general we do this kind of work fairly conservatively.
Mr. Richard Royal.
First question, Dr. Wallace, you're not suggesting that we consolidate all the counties now, are you?
No.
Good. Second question, have you done any comparison on how much, if all the sales tax exemptions were gone, how much that would reduce the personal income tax if you applied it to that rather than the sales tax?
We didn't do that specifically, but for instance, if we wiped out all of the exemptions, it would take over the income tax. You would more than offset a full reduction in the income tax.
Representative Martin, you have a question?
I have a question, and I know we don't have time to drill down on all these exemptions. I just want to try to understand.
Sure.
Particularly the credit for trade-ins. One purchases a car for $10 or $10,000, and you pay sales tax on that new car or that used car purchased from the dealer. If 5 years later one trades that car in and gets a $5,000 value and buys another $10,000 car, then you only pay tax on the difference. So we're considering the trade-in being an exemption, but in fact that's already been that car has already been taxed. And I just try to look at any other places in our economy where Georgians are expected to pay sales tax on something twice.
Yeah, that's the right interpretation for that, and it's by our understanding of the tax code, that's considered an exemption. But as I mentioned, not all exemptions are inappropriate or
But if we weren't careful about that, then when people come to, and I know food's already exempt,
right,
bring us up, but I'll use this as an example. If it weren't, then we would end up in a place where we could actually be charging people a sales tax on something that they have a coupon for, or something that they're giving a value and getting for free. It would be a similar situation.
Right.
Okay. Just want to make sure I understand what we're doing. I'm sorry. Can I follow up on Mr. Chairman? Sure. Tell me about under B, also here, personal property brought into Georgia. I mean, that's not necessarily exempted is they're not supposed to be, I mean, technically, Georgians should be paying a use tax on that property, should they not? I mean, those aren't exemptions. Those are just property, personal property purchased outside the state and brought in is in fact subject to tax. It's just, we probably don't have a manner by which to collect that.
I'm sorry, which one are you on?
It's in exemption A, it's about 5 or 6 down.
Oh, okay.
Personal property brought into Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if property is, if some furniture is purchased in North Carolina and brought into Georgia, they're not taxed in North Carolina because you're a Georgia resident. Technically, one should pay a use tax. So that's not really an exemption. That's just failure to capture a use tax, isn't it?
Yeah, I have to admit I would need to look a little bit more specifically into a particular one like that.
Okay.
Because it shouldn't be listed as an exemption if it's covered under the use tax.
Chairman O'Neill?
Yeah, out of all these, and I assume you had a chance to look at them all since you've compiled them, from the standpoint of obsolescence, or basically being antiquated from the initial purpose, whether it be charitable or economic development or whatever might have been the purpose of it. Are there 2 or 3 you could tell us about that maybe shouldn't be around anymore, or we should be looking at as far as the efficacy of them in the code?
Specifically with this list, I mean,
the honeybees, I can see that pretty quick.
Yeah. In instance, you know, it's a fairly small item, the sale of sodgrass. I don't know how long that one in particular has been along. If it's installation in an industrial property, then there would be reason to consider an exemption for it. If it has a history of some other basis that may be antiquated, that could be one. You know, the big ticket items on here are issues, again, like food for home consumption, which is not necessarily obsolescent, but changes the buoyancy or the natural growth in the sales tax. But it's not under the category of obsolescence.
One last follow-up question. It's been said by many that exemptions actually just spread taxation to other areas. Walk me through that, because what I'm hearing from you is that we lose $9-point-something billion of revenue from the exemptions, but I don't see how any of these exemptions cost in other areas. How does that? Is that with the assumption that we have to raise so much by?
I think it's with the assumption that if we want to get a certain revenue basket, then we're going to be taking it from different baskets. And if you don't take it from the sales tax, you're going to take it from, you know, another type of tax, which may or may not be a better tax for Georgia. You know, if it's coming at a tax that has a bigger impact on economic development, then it may be more costly to Georgia in the long term.
Yes, sir, Representative Roy.
Dr. Wallace, you may have answered this when Representative Martin asked you the question, but this on these trade-ins for automobiles especially, those trade-ins are ultimately sold and taxes are collected on those. Has that been taken in consideration on these numbers?
I'm sorry, which part? The
used car trade-ins.
Uh-huh.
When those cars are sold, sales tax is collected on them. So are these numbers adjusted for the?
That should be the net.
Okay.
Yeah.
Representative Parrish.
Dr. Wallace, let me ask you a question, and it's sort of an exemption because I guess we don't know what to do with it, but what impact would this have on our sales tax if we knew what to do about internet sales and tax on that?
It's a large question. The estimates for the impact of internet sales on Georgia, I think the numbers that we're seeing now are that the impact, if we could tax internet sales, is around 5% of revenue currently. The concern is that has continued to grow. It sounds small, but it's come up from, it was about 1.5% a couple years ago when we were looking at it. One of the big concerns being in the business-to-business trading on the internet and the impact that has. So, you know, in absolute terms, it's not as large as some of these numbers now, but the concern is long-term.
What sort of growth rate do you see for that, or are you able to determine that?
It's subject to an awful lot of speculation, and some of the numbers that we have seen show a growth rate of 5 to 6% per year. Others are much more conservative, but then you hear people talking about 15% per year. I think that that's probably unrealistic that it would be that large.
Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Wallace, thank you. I'd like to ask you one question, if I could, and that would be, I think it would be real productive, at least for me, and I think the other members would like it as well, if we could have maybe a list, all these exemptions that are listed here, of ones that through your studies you would recommend we do something to look at.
Chairman O'Neill was
That's
speaking
right.
of,
But
yeah.
I think a list would be helpful. And thank you. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. It's great information.
We have another representative that slipped in, and I failed to mention Representative Ron Stevens is with us today. He's also on the Ways and Means Committee. And Representative Carl Rogers, who represents Hall County. Will both of you stand up? There's Carl in the back, and Representative Stevens. Glad to have y'all with us. All right. Our next presentation is by Alan Essage. He's the Executive Director of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. And so if you would come at this time and share your remarks. Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The presentation is Comprehensive Tax Reform, a Focus on Fairness. That should be in your packet. I just want to talk. The Georgia Budget and Policy Institute issued a report about 3 or 4 weeks ago, trying to show what an example of comprehensive tax reform could look like. The example, there were examples. They weren't the best way to do it, or the only way to do it, or the right way to do it, but just to kind of show taking all sorts of different taxes into consideration, tax cuts, tax increases, how that would affect the system. One of the things that we try to look at, and that we hope you all try to look at as you look through the system, is linking taxes to the budget. It's really important to understand what the budget looks like, what's driving the budget, because as you're developing a tax system to raise revenues, you have to have some sense of how much revenues you need and then how to raise them fairly. One thing to remember is 85% of the state budget is education, healthcare, health and social services, and criminal justice. And that's a real important number, because if you're at a point where you're short money, if you go through a recession, or if you end up doing a large amount of tax cuts in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if you're short, the places you end up hitting are education and healthcare, because that's where the money is. If you take out education, healthcare, health human services, criminal justice, transportation, debt service, and the tax cut we have appropriated in the budget, which is the homeowners tax relief credit, all the rest of the state agencies are less than 4% of the budget. So you could basically wipe out the entire state bureaucracy, fire thousands of people, and save about $600 to $700 million. So if you're in a situation like we were 3 or 4 years ago in the recession, and we were short up to over $1 billion, that's why education and Medicaid were hit, because you can't just wipe out the entire bureaucracy. And I think it's an important concept to understand. Georgia is the 9th largest and 5th fastest growing state, and again, that's what generally drives the budget. Population state government serves grow faster than the overall population. Overall population growth from 1990 to 2005 was about 40%. Medicaid grew about 126% during that time, and the prison population grew about 153% during that time. And looking at the adequacy of funds, if you look at the amount of revenues Georgians pay, the amount of revenues Georgians pay compared to their income, we're actually at about a 25-year low. We were consistently about 6%, which meant on a per capita basis, about 6% of Georgians' income went to support state government. That, at the height of the recession, that dropped to about 5.4%. It's gone up through 2005 to about 5.6%, which is still about almost 0.5% less than it has been historically. That 0.4 of a point equals about $1 billion. So if we were collecting revenues at the same rate that we've been collecting between 1980 and 2001, the budget would be about $1 billion bigger than it is today. Another thing, again, we're looking at the tax system as a whole. It's a question of whether the tax system is aggressive, progressive, or proportional. A progressive tax system means those who make more pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes. A proportional system makes it's generally even between those who make the low income and the high income. And a regressive system means that the lower income pays a higher percentage of their income in taxes. Georgia, with state and local taxes, has a regressive system. The lower income pay a larger percentage of their income than the higher. Now, it doesn't mean, and this is sometimes misunderstood, you can have a millionaire who will pay more in taxes than someone who makes $20,000 actually earns. So it's not that they're not paying more dollar amount, but the percentage of their income, they'll pay less than someone making $20,000 on average. It's also important to look at the tax system of whether fairness of those within the same income group, they're paying the same as somebody else. And the biggest example of this is between seniors and non-seniors. This is based on 2002 data. Seniors overall pay about have an effective tax rate of about 1%, and non-seniors is about 2.5%. That would even be more of a gap today because the 2002 numbers did not include the income exclusion increasing to $35,000 by 2008. So you have a situation where someone making the same income, but based on age, ends up paying less in taxes than another person. There are several, principles that we would hope that we would look at when we talk about modernizing the tax system. I mean, one is improving the fairness between people with similar incomes and people with different incomes, protecting the adequacy of funds by ensuring the tax base reflects the 21st century economy, and that any tax cuts are coupled with offsetting tax increases. And again, that's important for looking at what the budget needs are, not just now, but what the needs are going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now. Several tax reform options with the income tax. You can give tax cuts by broadening the tax brackets. You can offset that by creating a new rate. If you created a new 7% rate, you could pay for broadening the brackets, adjusting the standard deductions and personal exemptions for inflation, creating a refundable earned income tax credit, which is basically modeled after the federal earned income tax credit. The state portion of that could be a percentage, either 5, 10, 20% of what the federal earned income tax credit is. And that's a tax credit that is geared towards those working, poor, moderate income who generally make less than $30,000 a year. In the sales tax, one of the things that we just talked about is rethinking sales tax exemptions. And I think it's something that, a reform that won't cost a dime is, and I think would answer a lot of the questions you all had based on the last presentation, was implementing a tax expenditure report. About 35 other states have a tax expenditure report. And what it is it's part of the budget where all the tax exemptions, including sales tax and income tax, dealing with business tax credits, would be listed out as all the budget expenditures are listed out. So what you end up getting is a report similar to what Georgia State did, except produced by the OPB or the Audit Office, both Department of Audits, and made part of the budget. And that would give the General Assembly the option to make choices. If there's a tax exemption A that's costing the state $500,000 and a budget need that might cost the state $500,000, right now you have no idea on the tax end what options are out there. A tax expenditure report would give you a menu and allow you to make those kind of choices. What some states do also, taking it one step further, and in some tax exemptions is appropriate and some it's not, because some are not really there for policy reasons and some are, is having some kind of evaluation or outcomes. Business tax credits, I think, are a good example of that. If you had part of the tax expenditure report, how much each business tax credit is costing, and then also outcome measures on whether they're serving the policy purpose that they were put in for, again, it will give you information to make decisions. Because clearly not all tax exemptions, whether it's sales or income, are bad. Some are very proper policy, very proper politically, and make sense economic development-wise. It's allowing you to have the information to make that decision for yourself on whether it's serving the purpose. Another thing to do is expanding the sales tax base to services. And if you do that, you could actually lower the sales tax rate. If discounting business-to-business services, if all household services were covered under the sales tax, you could actually lower the sales tax rate from 4% to 3.5%. And also increasing the cigarette taxes. This is one that is less than tax policy reasons than health policy reasons. the single best Medicaid reform, health policy reform, I think the state could do is by stopping 16-year-olds today from smoking. 20, 30, 40 years from now, that would have a bigger impact on the Medicaid budget than just about anything else we're doing. So if raising the price of cigarettes will prevent teens from taking up smoking, it has a long-term budget impact. In the short term, obviously, it has a revenue impact. I think it's estimated a $1 increase in the cigarette tax would raise about $500 million. One of the things we talk about is the importance of not, if you were to do something like that, of not budgeting all $500 million. Because if the tax works the way you want it to for public policy purposes, smoking should decrease over time. So therefore, the revenues theoretically will decrease over time. So what you want to do is actually underestimate the revenue estimate on that. And our recommendation would be to put that money in the reserves. For instance, if you raised it by $1 and you estimated it would raise $500 million, you only budget $350 million of it. At the end of the year, you'd have a $150 million surplus, which could be placed in the reserve accounts. Property taxes is another reform. I mean, it's a very controversial subject. Is you can create a property tax circuit breaker, which basically holds property taxes to a certain percent of income. And this reform could be revenue neutral if you were to substitute the circuit breaker for the homeowner's tax relief credit. The homeowner's tax relief credit is $434 million. And the price of a circuit breaker would be totally dependent on what level of income you do it at, what percentage that you have. But that's a way of helping out low and moderate income folks and guaranteeing that their property tax will not raise above a certain percentage of income. And then corporate income tax, something I think that the chairman led the way on is Georgia closed one of the biggest corporate loopholes a couple of years ago, the Delaware Holding Company loophole. There are two smaller loopholes, corporate loopholes, that could be closed, that could raise, and I'm sure we have a solid estimate on how much, but it could raise X amount of dollars if we did that. Another thing, and this was a change that was actually made for the feds that the General Assembly actually didn't ever vote one way or the other on, although I think it's clear which way the vote would go. And that's the estate tax. About 24 states have retained the estate tax revenue by either decoupling from the federal code or by levying a state estate tax. Georgia did not decouple from the Fed, so basically our estate tax has gone away. If we were to bring that back, it would bring in about $150 million. If you look at the last two charts, this gives you examples, two examples of, again, what comprehensive tax reform could look like. Again, this is not a recommendation. This is not saying this is the best or the only. The possibilities are literally endless. But if you, an important concept, I think, there are, and I know Representative Royal very good-naturedly always kids me, is there any tax cut that I would support? Because I spend a lot of time in the Ways and Means Committee arguing against tax cuts. And these are examples of, there are lots of tax cuts built in here, but they're paid for with other revenue, because there's no free lunch. If you give tax cut A, B, C, D, and E, the bottom line is the state's going to lose $500, $600, $700, $800 million unless somehow you make up the revenue some other way. So these are examples of reforming the income tax system, which actually would overall be a tax cut, broadening the sales tax base and actually reducing the sales tax rate, but then you increase the cigarette taxes and decouple the federal estate tax, and you have a higher income tax rate. You could end up paying for it. And example A actually gives again, it raises $245 million, but again, our recommendation would be that would end up being put in the reserves. But in that recommendation, the bottom 85% of taxpayers would receive a tax cut. In example B, the bottom 95% of taxpayers would have a tax cut. So it is, if you look at it comprehensively, and if you look at how to replace revenues with the targeted cuts that you think are necessary, it is possible to retain revenues. It is possible even to increase revenues and still give a large majority of Georgians tax relief.
All right. Any questions from members of the committee? Thank you for your presentation. Our next Representative Rogers, if you'd like to come sit with us, you certainly may. There's an extra seat up here. If you'd like to remain where you are, that's fine as well, but you're welcome. At this time, I'm going to depart from the agenda just for a second, and want to ask Tommy Hills, who is Chief Financial Officer in the governor's office, if he would like to come and share for a moment.
Thank you, Representative Mills and committee members and other guests. Just some general comments, mostly about reserves, but I will make a couple of other comments. In form of the tax spending that Dr. Essick had talked about, I just would know from an information standpoint that the Office of Ways and Means in the House and the Office of Planning and Budget and the Revenue Department for the last couple of years have been putting that list together on an annual basis and looking at those tax cuts. So we've got maybe 3 years, I guess, Michelle, where you in terms of those things we've been reporting that speak somewhat to the point that that Alan was making. And that is information available in terms of looking at it. And the way it's been taken into account each year as far as after the fact is as we have the state economists prepare the revenue estimate is a deduction from the revenue estimate for those new reductions in income tax or sales tax or whatever tax was reduced. So we are trying to pay some attention to that. Not exactly the point you're making, Alan, but there is an information base on that. I want to talk a bit about reserves and really somewhat of a follow-up to what Dr. Bordeaux talked about. I think as you may know, or some of you may know, that we made two primary changes to the reserve law in 2005 by raising the max cap on that reserve fund from 5% to 10%. We combined what was the mid-year adjustment reserve with the revenue shortfall reserve, still allowing the first 1%, up to 1% to come out for public education growth. It used to be able to be used for other things other than public education growth if the public education growth wasn't up to 1%. So now it's limited somewhat there. And then raise the max on which you couldn't appropriate from 3% to 4%. Dr. Bordeaux makes a point of raising it 5%. I think we're looking at kind of a gradual thing. I think certainly wouldn't object to that level of need. What really happened from a reality standpoint is Dr. Bordeaux referenced is that I looked at the not real dollar but the actual dollar percentages that she looked at, and I think we were something like 5% reduction in revenue in 2002 and 2.5% in 2003. And had we not had those reserves at the level we did, that at the close to 12% level that Dr. Bordeaux referenced, we would have been in really bad shape. I mean, we would have, you just can't turn the battleship in the middle of the creek that quickly to reduce your expenditures when you don't know that your revenue is going to be reduced to the extent it was. I started with the governor's office in early June of 2003, just after y'all broke up the legislative session that year, I think. And the state economist was still sticking by his prediction. We had a mid-June conversation with the bond rating agencies because we were in the process of selling some bonds at that time, and he was still thinking that we were going to not go down 2.5% that year, but go down something like 1%. So we were unfortunately determined that we did have that shortfall, and that that amounted to a couple $100 million more in less in revenue than we thought we had. That budget had appropriated some dollars from the revenue shortfall reserve when we thought there was an excess in it, and when we ended up short, we actually didn't have that excess, but we already appropriated some money, so we ended up taking the reserves down to a net of $50 million at the end of fiscal year 2003 after the mid-year adjustment had been paid out. And that was just dangerous. That's less than a day's worth of revenue for the state government. And where that came into play next year was that in 2004, because we didn't make the revenue estimate when we thought we would in 2003, the percentage of growth we had that time in 2004 was higher than what was realistic. The number had already been set. And so, as you remember, we cut the revenue estimate a couple times during that General Assembly session, which turned out to be accurate. We did not know we made the budget until the very last day of the year, that June 30th of that year. I think we got in something like $80 million in revenue, and we wouldn't have made the budget if we hadn't gotten that much revenue in that last day. So we were that close with $50 million in reserves if it, been a lesser month, we would have gone down to about 0 in reserves. So we do know, having 2 years in succession and having recession, where we went down 7.5%, 8% in budget on the budget revenue, that you do need to have a base there. Otherwise, you're just playing a dangerous game, and you'd have to make decisions of laying people off at the last month of the year and things like that. That obviously are not a good management technique. Comment about the reserves. I think I've sat now with bond rating agencies, and I think it's about 36 times since I've been here. We generally meet them. 36 times for the 3 agencies. We generally meet with them 4 times a year for bond issues, and then one general session where we just got to try to sell the financial strength of the state. And so what I hear, I'm not the quickest thing in the world, but after 36 times to listen to people, you do pick up some general trends about what they think is important. And the level of reserves is certainly one of those top 4 or 5 items that the external rating worlds are looking at in terms of how they rate Georgia as a AAA state, and the credibility that we have as a strong financial organization. Other factors that are very important are the relative growth rate of our revenue, our economy, relative to the rest of the country. I think that the only thing that was a fail-safe for us in the 2002 and 2003 downturn is the other states had the same problem, and so relatively we didn't look any worse, really much worse than anybody else. We were a little bit slower coming back, but so relative economic position. They also favor people who have balanced sources of revenue, that you don't get all your revenue from one source. So if you've got an array of different primary tax sources like sales tax, corporate income tax, individual income tax, motor fuel taxes, that you're better able to buffer vagaries in the economy than if you just relied on 1 or 2 sources. Financial reporting is another factor, obviously, and then practice, whether you have conservative financial practices or not, are also very important. I would like to comment, basically go to, not so much from a rating agency standpoint, but the way that the economic development folks rate us. And this is a little bit in difference of agreement with Dr. Essig on this, but though some states do have graduated corporate and personal income tax rates, those people who rate states on attractiveness of economic development rate us very highly because we don't have graduated rates. So part of bringing new business into Georgia is the fact that our personal income tax and our corporate income tax are not indexed on a sliding scale based on amount. The reason for reserves, one other factor. The Director Board referenced this too from a cash flow standpoint. We actually did, December 15th, 2003, get down to where we weren't sure we had enough money in the Treasury. That was the time where in that month, you prepay salaries for the regents in early December because they're off in December, and their allotment gets up, and you don't get the big revenues until January. And we were very, very close to not thinking we might not have enough money. Fortunately, we did. Enough revenue came in that month that we were okay, but it was very, very close. And so it just goes to the point of making sure that we do have adequate reserves. And the process we went through in determining that we should raise the max level of those reserves and the minimum level by 1 percentage point was talking to our financial advisor firm in New York that guides us on bond issues and financial management. And they did look at the other, just like Dr. Bordeaux referenced, other AAA rated states, and came up to that 5 to 10% range as being the most prudent level that we look at. So I urge us to kind of keep that in mind as we look at its different tax changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tom, any questions from any members of the committee? Chairman O'Neill?
I mean, that's a pretty big range, 5 to 10% in the scope of all that. 4%, as I understand, it's less than 2 weeks. We ask our local governments, as a matter of fiscal oversight, to budget reserves in the neighborhood of 3 months. Why do we feel like that 5 to 10% is adequate?
Well, I guess the answer to the question is it's a delicate balance, as we all know. I think that you want to make sure that you're not building too much reserves because people get antsy, you're overcharging on taxes, and so I think there's a gradual ramp up. When I said that we went up from 3 to 4%, and certainly think going up to a minimum of 5% would be reasonable. Over time, I could see us going up a little bit, moving into that gradation of a higher level of reserve, because I do think it's prudent to have it higher than 4 or 5%. I mean, we know we can go through 4% in 2 years because we did. So.
Representative Parrish.
Mr. Tibbs, let me ask you a question. From your conversations with the bond rating folks, and of course we've got a AAA bond rating, we're all proud of that. Would it be fair to say that one thing that helps us maintain that is the fact that our tax system is based on a broader base? By that I mean income tax, sales tax, and other things, as opposed to maybe like Florida when the recession hit and all theirs is based on sales tax, and you saw what a dramatic downturn that had. So isn't that important from your conversations with the bonding agencies?
It's very important to have diverse sources of income with some balance in there. Thank you very much.
Tommy. Okay. All right, our next presenter is one of our own, Representative Ron Stevens, who's here going to share with us, and he also has Barry White with him, who's chairman of the Tourism Development Alliance of Georgia, and also Joy Wallstrom is with us to make a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Ron Stevens. I'm the chairman of Economic Development and Tourism for the Georgia House. I represent Savannah, Bryan County, and Liberty County, big chunk clearly. I would like to give some accolades before I talk a little bit about the Hotel Motel Tax and where I think it ought to go, and mostly a little bit of where we've come with the Hotel Motel Tax. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, just so that you know where Georgia is economically, and even more important where their future is economically, the LAFA report came out, which is an economist during the Reagan administration, who said that Georgia's economic future is rated #1 in the country for future economic development. So with the hard work with the administration, and especially this particular group over a period of years, I just thought it'd be appropriate that you know that. Georgia's laid down a track for economic development, eliminated many barriers to business, and a lot of it should go to Chairman O'Neill with the hard work of eliminating one of the biggest barriers in the single factor corporate tax, and deserves some accolades for that. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the Hotel Motel Tax. My predecessor, Mickey Chenell, from, again, in North Georgia, in Oconee, came about trying to tighten up some of the Hotel Motel Tax law that we've had over a period of years, and did a very good job of that. But we need to continue that effort. The Hotel Motel Tax was initiated back in the early 1900s, and strangely enough, the city of Detroit, as they were losing a lot of their convention areas, they decided to impose their own tax on themselves. That is, a fee on themselves before it became a real tax. The purpose for that tax was nothing more, nothing less than to promote themselves, to get tourism and to get those conventions back to the city of Detroit, and it worked. In Georgia, we started ours about mid-1970s, and currently we have about 23 versions of the Hotel Motel Tax. Over 200 taxing districts are involved. Over 5 agencies touch, at least 5 agencies touch the Hotel Motel Tax in either its collection, implementation, policing, which is our cities and counties, GMA, ACCG, DCA, the Department of Community Affairs, Department of Economic Development, and of course the Department of Revenue. So as you might imagine, with all of these 23 different versions of the tax, there is still some confusion. And it would be safe to say that there's probably a considerable amount of collecting tax, that, or even worse, spending the tax that's collected inappropriately. That essentially is the overview, but I would like to point out that as we tighten up this Hotel Motel Tax, like everything else, as this committee knows, it's like a domino effect, because as we collect the Hotel Motel Tax, as we self-promote tourism, and in Savannah it's the #1 industry, it also has an effect on other taxes that are also beneficial. The local option sales tax, which is your 5th sales tax penny. around the state as the Hotel Motel Tax promotes. It also generates the SPLOST, the Special Purpose Local Option Sales Tax, not to mention the counties that have a special education local option sales tax. As this money that's self-imposed on hoteliers to collect and promote in that area of tourism, all of these taxes go up, which of course all of us knows eliminates the burden to property taxes, which is a nasty word to a lot of people, and probably the least liked tax of all. Before I go though, I'd like to, Dan Rowe, our Deputy Commissioner, was just in an automobile accident, and he was going to join us also, but he is not hurt. For those of you looking around with your mouth, he's fine, and he'll just be late getting here. But I would like to introduce Barry White from Augusta, who will give you the intricacies of the bills. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Stevens and Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Just go into a little bit more detail about why this code needs to be simplified. Merely the fact that there are 23 versions speaks to that. Personally, I've had about 3 attorneys give me an opinion on this tax. I think I got back 8 opinions from those 3 attorneys.
Only 8?
Only 8. But I just want to let you know that the groups that Representative Stevens mentioned, the GMA, ACCG, the Department of Revenue, the DCA, and the tourism industry have been working together to come up with some points of agreement that need to be addressed as we look at this state code. A few of those that we need to, items that we need to clarify is, one is who is exempt from paying the tax. There seems to be some confusion right now on qualifying nonprofits or government entities. Some are exempt, some are not, and some don't know. We also need to clarify who, if any, is exempt from collecting the tax. There are certain innkeepers and campgrounds or lodges that currently are not collecting the tax, and there's some confusion about that. We also need to establish a process for what happens to the dedicated pennies for capital investment once the bonds are paid. There are some examples across the state where the tax that was originally started in the 70s is paying for a bond indebtedness on certain facilities. Those facilities may have lived through their life cycle, but the debt continues to be reissued and the funding continues to those facilities. The next is allowing for the recipient of the tax, the one who actually expends the funds once it's collected, is allowing them to build a reserve. It's difficult for organizations such as the Convention and Visitors Bureau or a Chamber of Commerce to operate strategically without knowing or without the availability or possibility of establishing some reserves. The last item, which the groups have all agreed need to be clarified, is the language for the qualifying nonprofit or the recipient of the tax. Right now it's a little confusing. Convention and Visitor Bureaus are in there, 501c6s listed in general, chambers of commerce, and then in those 23 code sections, many different types of organizations are identified to be qualified to expend the funds that are collected. So the process is being reviewed by these organizations. We're doing this together. We want to come back collectively with some recommendations, and we're exploring other items that are under consideration. We again strongly suggest that this code is simplified so that we can get it down to maybe 3 opinions from 3 attorneys.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
I'm a little concerned with your statement that there's an array of entities or organizations, if you will, that have the authority to appropriate these funds as they're collected. We promulgate the tax, but how do you feel about the accountability to the public? I know the municipal associations in many cases, they're subservient to the electorate, and they set up the community service, whatever you call it, there. But chambers of commerce and other organizations like that are maybe 501c3s or whatever, they're really not accountable to the public in any way. You wouldn't consider it a dangerous precedent to be having a tax and then turning it over to a non-accountable, not that there's anything wrong with Chambers of Commerce, I
Right.
love them, but entities that are not really accountable to the electorate?
Well, yes, and just in my opinion, I think that there does need to be accountability. And right now, that is the responsibility of the local government to make sure that those funds, if they go to a Chamber of Commerce or a Convention and Visitors Bureau, that there is accountability. Many times there is not, but hopefully that could be strengthened in the new code.
Any other questions from any other members? Well, all right, well, 23 different versions throughout the state of the hotel motel tax is quite a few. Thank you. All right, our next presenter will be Steve Williams, who is Executive Vice President of Georgia Forestry Association, and also John Hopkins is joining him as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman O'Neill, members of the committee. We appreciate very much the opportunity to speak before you today. My name is Steve McWilliams. I serve as the Executive Vice President of Georgia Forestry Association, as the Chairman said. Our association is the principal advocacy organization for Georgia's very diverse forestry community. Our membership is comprised of forest landowners, forest product businesses, pulp and paper mills, sawmills, consultants, loggers, anybody that has anything to do with or passion for forestry has a place in the Georgia Forestry Association. And together, all of those groups and individuals sustain one of the state's major economic drivers. I will be speaking off of the handout with the golden logo in the top right-hand corner. Should have been given to you before the meeting. I have with me today Mr. Joe Hopkins, who is a forest landowner himself in Charlton County, former president of the Georgia Forestry Association. Mr. Hopkins also serves on the Department of Community Affairs Board and was a member of the Governor's Advisory Council for the Georgia Land Conservation Partnership. He also currently serves as the legislative chairman for the Forest Landowners Association, which is a national advocacy group for forest landowners. Approximately 3,000 of FLA's 10,000 members are located here in Georgia. If you've identified the handout, I noticed in my looking over it before the meeting that in my final draft, I left off a few lines at the bottom. I will get the complete testimony to you following the meeting. In addition, there are a couple of addendums that describe briefly the conservation use program in Georgia and give you sort of a profile of Georgia forestry. I'll give those to you. I will not be going into those today for the sake of time and try to respect the time that the chairman has allocated to us today. Well, we're here essentially for two reasons. First, because we believe that in the long term, sustainability of our woodlands and working landscapes in the state depend heavily on a working relationship between public officials like yourselves, the forest business community, and private non-industrial landowners. Second, we believe that Georgia's 150-year-old ad valorem tax system is broken, that it is obsolete in ways that pose immediate and long-term threats to the state's forests, the economic, environmental, and social benefits that they provide for each one of us. Our ad valorem property tax system has really not changed a great deal since it was created well over a century ago to fund local governments and a few years later to fund public schools. But the same certainly cannot be said for the state of Georgia. Needless to say, the Georgia of 2006 differs greatly from the Georgia of 1852. For example, in the 19th century, land was a principal source of wealth and thus one of the few significant sources of tax revenue to fund government operations. Today, as you all know, we're witnessing a rapid, irreversible shift from a rural agrarian economy to one in which more of the wealth and influence is concentrated in urban centers and sprawling suburbia. Yet, local property taxes continue to place an inordinate burden on many of Georgia's rural property owners. This is manifested in a system with property taxes that tends, this may be somewhat of an oversimplification, but it paints the picture, that tends to tax forest land based on its highest and best use rather than on its actual or current use, and which fails to recognize all of the ecological services to a community and to the state, which also in their own right have economic value. The need to respond to this trend has been highlighted recently in a number of ways. First, the August 2004 report of the Governor's Advisory Council for the Georgia Land Conservation Partnership concluded that the existing ad valorem tax policy, and I quote, "The existing ad valorem tax policy is a disincentive for maintaining and conserving farms and forest lands." That same report recommended that the state should undertake and consider amending the funding mechanisms for local governments and school boards that would permit consideration of the current use method of ad valorem taxation. Second, and more recently, the Joint Future of Forestry Study Committee, chaired by Senator Ross Collison and Representative Lynn Smith, in its final report issued in December of 2005, recommended that there be further study of the tax system's impact, and I'm quoting, "Further study of the tax system's impact on forest landowners and the forest industry by examining Georgia's taxation system in its entirety." I certainly consider the work that you're doing as a major first step in that direction, and appreciate and value that. And then even more recently, in testimony earlier this summer before this very committee, the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia noted that agricultural and forest landowners pay significantly more in property taxes than they demand in services from local governments. And there are studies that have documented that and have certainly backed that point up. Our dilemma in trying to address this issue with public policy officials over the past few years has not been that there's been much disagreement with our position, but that it has been difficult to convey an understanding of the problem that would be widespread enough to lead to a commitment to do a serious study of it. In the end, we're talking about more than tax policy here. We're really talking about the kind of Georgia we will leave to those who come after us. How green will it be? Once undeveloped land is gone, it will not reappear. We could discuss in much more detail economic and environmental consequences of maintaining a status quo in this area. But at this point, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask Mr. Hopkins to speak on this subject from the perspective of a landowner who lives with the problem every day.
Mr. Hopkins.
Thank you. I have also provided some notes, and mine just has kind of not anything fancy at the top.
Okay.
Steve recognized that I've been on several committees, and I'm encouraged by the possibility that this committee is in a position to recommend some type of equitable remedy to the problem we have. To put it on a more personal basis, in the last 10 years, the ad valorem taxes on the property we have, our timberland, has tripled. During that same amount of time, of course, our fuel costs have gone up, our employee costs have gone up, and I have attached two graphs on there that was done by Timber Mart South that shows pine timber has actually decreased in value in the last 10 years. And these are actual dollars, these are not inflation adjusted. If you adjust them over that 10 years for inflation, it's a much more bleak picture than that graph actually shows. This is exactly the problem we have. As Steve mentioned, we know the huge positive environmental impact that our forest land provides for our state, particularly the greenhouse gases cleanup that it does. As we all know, plants bring in carbon dioxide, store the carbon, and release the oxygen that we breathe. So these lands provide a very valuable resource. They also purify billions of gallons of water, and I don't have to tell you all what water resources mean to the state of Georgia. I'm sure you know much more about that than I do, and the problems with it. Our current ad valorem tax policy, however, creates an enormous disincentive for forest landowners in Georgia, and it seeks us to seek other less desirable uses for our property. The result is development, fragmentation of the large contiguous tracts, loss of wildlife management areas, which we had one we lost several years ago, and a state that will change its character over time. What can be done? For some large landowners and some large contiguous tracts, unfortunately, it's too late. They're gone. For many others, however, there's still time. To value land in its current use, as Mr. McWilliams stated, would be a tremendous step in the right direction. Possibly even better would be to open up the CUBA valuation to all forest landowners, because this would also add the protection of a 10-year covenant not to do anything with the property, as well as a system where it's valued statewide rather than valued by each local county. I found it interesting when I read in the paper not long ago that we were considering taking ad valorem taxes off of automobiles. First of all, I wasn't aware that was a problem, as we have identified this issue as a problem in the state of Georgia for a long time as far as timberland goes. But I also would like to see us have a tax policy that would maybe encourage less cars and more forest land rather than encourage cheaper operating cars and less timberland. The University of Georgia did a study to see if all forest land was put under CUBA regardless of ownership type or number of acres, and it was estimated that would cost the counties and schools between $25 and $50 million. This amount could easily be supplemented and then phased out over time as the digest of these counties increased. I mentioned a second policy in here. I won't go into it in the interest of time because I see I'm almost out, but it involves the fact that we lost capital gains tax treatment in the late 80s, and yet we're still required to capitalize our expenses. There's a certain amount of inequity in there that I certainly think needs addressing, and I addressed it in my written materials. Y'all excuse me, my allergies flared up pretty bad, and I'm struggling here. No one understands, I think, long-term investment any more than a forest landowner. Home Depot buys a hammer today, puts it on the shelves it tomorrow, rotates that stock maybe 100 times during the year on the same shelf space. A forest landowner plants a tree and waits 25 or 30 years before ever getting significant income from the tree. How many of you today are willing to put your money in investment that you're going to have to wait 25 or 30 years before you ever get anything out of it? That's a long-term commitment. And that's what the forest landowners of this state are doing. In summary, I can't overemphasize the importance of addressing the tax problems facing forest landowners in Georgia, particularly ad valorem property taxes on forest land. I was encouraged about a year ago when it appeared that an effort was underway to create another method for funding education. It appears, however, that issue has been put on the back burner for the current time. The problem has been identified and discussed in this state in depth. It's time to make some important decisions. Once a problem is identified, the decision to do nothing about the problem is yet still a decision. We have moved education out of last place in Georgia, fortunately. So let's move our antiquated system of taxing Georgia forest land out of last place. We're the only state in the southeast that taxes it without putting it in its current use. And that's been a penalty of owning forest land in Georgia. Decisions need to be made in this state as to whether or not we want to encourage forest land ownership or fragmentation and development of our forest land tracts. Again, I will be glad to answer any questions that you have. And I'd like to close by paraphrasing a quote that I wish I could claim I originated, however I did not. And that is, do we want asphalt to be our final crop? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. Any questions from any members? Yes. Representative Roy.
Did you say that the estimated revenue loss if you opened up CUBA to all landowners was $25 to $50 million?
This was a study done by the University of Georgia, yes, sir.
All right, any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. Thank you for that presentation. All right, our next presenter is Clint Mueller, who is with the ACCG, and we'll ask Clint to come at this time. Share. After Clint makes his presentation, we'll take about an 8 to 10 minute break and then come back.
I stand between you all and your break.
This is terrible.
This is a tough job. That's fine right there.
Thank you, Chairman Mills, members of the committee. We appreciate you, again, allowing us to speak before this committee. We've already spoken on several issues, but at the first meeting, one issue that we mentioned was the different fees that we collect, or at least our constitutional officers collect, and whether those fees have been kept up to date to reflect true market costs for providing certain services. And we've come back, we did some research over the past couple months, and you've got a Excel spreadsheet in front of you. and I'm going to refer to that. But we've looked at all the different types of fees that our constitutional officers are charging. And in the far left column, you see the code section that authorizes the fee, who the constitutional officer is that collects the fee, the purpose of the fee, and please don't ask me what all these purposes are because I couldn't tell you myself. But there's a list there. And I want to say too that this does not include, some people get these fees confused with the fine add-on fees or surcharges. That's really a totally different issue. The fine add-on and surcharges, those are being collected and they're going to specific purposes, but there's not a direct tie with the purpose and the actual person that's being collected from. It's usually a penalty. Somebody's paying a penalty. Where these fees, there's actually a person that's coming into our courts or one of these constitutional officers' office, and they're being provided a specific service and having to pay a fee for that service. And I guess when you look at tax equity, we know that if the fees don't cover the cost of providing the service, then the only way for local governments to make up the difference is through tax revenues, mainly the property tax coming out of our general fund. So we feel like that we should try to keep the fee as close to the actual cost of providing the service as possible. Obviously, it shouldn't be any more than that because then it would turn into a tax. You can also see, second to the last column, when the fee was last amended in state law. You can see that several of them was back to 1991, 15 years ago. I don't think anybody up here would have a problem paying what they paid back in 1991 for things today. I mean, that's probably a pretty big deal. One thing you will not see on this chart, and we're continuing to do some research, is what the fee would actually have to be today to cover the full cost of providing that service. And I think that's going to be difficult because that's going to vary a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on the economies of scale in that jurisdiction. There's a number of factors, which again, that gets into the policy decision. Should these fees be set at the state level through state law, one size fits all, or should some of these be set at the local level? Because in some places it may cost more to provide services than others. So anytime you try to set a state fee, in some places it maybe generates a little more revenue than it actually costs to provide the service, and in other places it may not generate enough. If y'all have any questions about of what's in this chart, I'll try to answer any questions you have. The other handout that I gave you says tax reform proposals from ACCG. I'm not going to go through all these, but there's 16 items here that we feel like should be considered. Most of them deal with tax equity and how we feel like the tax system could be made fair. So if y'all would take a look at those. Most of these we've covered in other meetings that we've already presented at. But we were asked to come, Chairman O'Neill asked us to give y'all some specific things in writing on things that we would like to see reformed, and this is what this is.
All right, Clint, any questions from any of the members? Representative Roy?
Clint, the previous speaker gave an estimate of $25 million to $50 million, allowing, I guess, commercial property owners to enter in the cover. Have y'all done any numbers on that?
We have not. That's something we can take a look at. I know that the current program has really grown exponentially. I'm trying to think off the top of my head what it's costing us today, but it's at least 2 or 3 times that number. I don't know, how much it would actually cost. And I think the real thing with CUVA, they talk about it being a current use type assessment. It's really a lot lower than what a current use assessment would give you. If you look at the people that are in CUVA, if say a timber farmer sold it to somebody else that was going to farm it, in many cases they're going to get more than what their assessment is under the CUVA, because in the CUVA provision there's a 3% inflationary cap, and usually that gets people, that keeps the values down lower than what the current use is. So over time, those values are not even in line with what we consider current use values. But we can check on that number. I don't know what it would cost what the estimate would be to put all commercial properties that exist out there now that would qualify under CUVA, that would exceed the 2,000 acre limitation.
I wish you'd look at that. They had a handout that said 90% of all the timberland is owned privately, so they're eligible for the 2,000 acres for CUVA. So that only leaves 10% that would go in there, 10% of the
right.
forest landowner.
And the other thing is the 2,000 acre cap. Obviously, if we remove the 2,000 acre cap, a lot of the people that are currently going to have more than 2,000 acres that they're not getting CUVA value on. And I would assume that the commercial properties, being real large tracts of land, they would want to remove the 2,000 acres because that wouldn't give them much. They wouldn't get a whole lot of benefit if they only got 2,000 acres put into CUVA.
The 2005 estimate by the Department of Revenue for the total cost of CUVA was $149.3 million.
That's right. That's right.
That's
really grown.
One other question. In the tax proposal, creative property tax circuit breaker, have y'all done any numbers on that to see what that might be in terms of revenue?
Well, it really depends on how you design it, and we've looked at a lot of other states, and there's hundreds of ways actually you can design one of these. Depends on the income ratio that you set. The way the circuit breaker works, for those of you not familiar, it's tied to your income as a ratio of the value of the property, and when you hit a certain cap, say your income exceeds, the value of the property exceeds a certain percentage of your income, the taxes due, then the circuit breaker kicks in. So it would depend on where you set that level. I think in one state that I looked at recently, it's 5%. When your property taxes exceed 5% of your income, which is a pretty high threshold. So a threshold that high probably wouldn't cost us a lot of money. And then, then how you apply it, we'd have to look at that. I can't give you a number, but
are y'all going to look at it?
Sure. I mean, that's the way. The reason we put that in there is we hear a lot about people being taxed out of their homes or having a lot of difficulty paying the taxes because they've lived there for a long time, and the inflationary increases in the values are outstripping their ability to keep pace with their income. And if you want to provide tax relief, and we believe that that's a legitimate issue that needs to be addressed, but provide tax relief so people can't be taxed out of their homes, then that's the way to do it instead of these. We see a lot of blanket tax exemptions that catch everybody, and those are much more costly than these targeted type tax exemptions.
Any more questions? Representative Knight.
Two questions. One follow-up to Representative Royals. Talking about the tax circuit breaker and income, is that going to be a pretty reliable circuit breaker there? I know we're talking about income and people voluntarily with the income tax returns. I mean, is this going to be inaccurate?
It would have to be done through their tax returns. The way it works in other states is it's actually like an income tax credit. So when they file for their income taxes, they have to show on that form obviously how much they paid in property taxes and then how much their total income was, and that percentage is calculated, and then if they meet the criteria, then they can get a credit back through their income tax.
I'm just worried about all the folks who don't properly file their income taxes.
Well, you would have to file. That would be an encouragement to file income taxes, I guess.
The second question goes back to, I guess, your Excel spreadsheet. I want to make sure I understand this right, and I may not, but a lot of the fees are, you're saying, not used. Are we still collecting those fees, and are these no longer being collected?
No.
It says not used.
Yes. What we did, we asked the constitutional officers that helped us compile this list. There's a lot of fees that are on the books that they're no longer utilizing. So where you see a not used in the comment section, those are probably fees we could just take off the book, take out of state law, because they were used at one time in history, but today, for whatever reason, they're no longer being used, but there's still a provision in state law for that fee. So that's really more cleanup to the state code. If we're not using the fee anymore, those are things that we can take out of the state code to help make it cleaner.
Thank you.
Let me ask you about number 14. term surcharge, you're talking about 911 surcharge. What do you mean by surcharge? And is a wireless phone, is that a cell phone? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Right now, obviously, the telecom industry is changing greatly, and a lot of, if you go to Walmart, you see the Go phones, and a lot of parents are buying them for their kids. There's no 911 fees being collected on those types of phones. So as things change, the economy changes, and people use those types of phones more, there's less and less 911 revenues to support the 911 system, which means we have to rely on other types of revenue to pay for it. When we started the 911 system, everybody had landline phones, and that was primarily where we got our revenue, and it was a pretty equitable system because just about everybody had a landline phone. Now you're seeing a lot of people that are they don't even have landline phones anymore. They're just using cell phones, and now we're seeing a lot of these prepaid phones where you go buy them in the store, you buy so many minutes, so there's not even a service agreement, and those people don't pay any 911 fees right now.
Any other, Representative Martin?
Just real quick, but following up on that, I mean, there's more phone numbers per capita in Georgia than there was 5 years ago, and certainly more than 10 years ago. So you're collecting more 911 fees today than you did 5 and 10 years ago, right?
I'm sure we are, yes.
10 years ago, I paid one 911 fee for one hard line in my house. Now I pay that at four cell phones.
Right.
So, I mean, I understand you're trying to capture this, but I just don't want us to lose sight of the fact that the 911 fees collections are up as a percentage of are related to population.
Right. I think when it comes to equity, we feel like everybody should be paying. If what's being collected is too much, then we need to roll back the rates. But everybody needs to be paying a share of it. And
are you proposing that we look? I mean, is that a possibility if we were to capture some of these?
Sure.
I mean, are counties and cities collecting more 911 fees than they need?
No. When the 911 fee statute was written, there's a provision in the 911 fee law that specifically says if you collect more than you're supposed to collect, there has to be a rollback. They can't use this for other things.
I understand. Former mayor, trick question, but I just
okay.
I thought you were volunteering to roll back.
No, we'll have to roll back if we get more than we need.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take a break. We'll meet back here at 3:45, 4:45.
Use of rights away by another provider have to be subject to the same terms and conditions. Typically, there's a provision in there saying that the franchise fee is in lieu of other fees and taxes, including occupation taxes and permit fees. Again, the franchise fee is the payment for the rental of the municipal rights of way. It is just one of many terms. It's really the equivalent of paying for the purchase or condemnation of property to run utility lines in the unincorporated area. And again, there is no franchise fee unless there's an agreement. Different utilities and different cities are going to have different franchise fee amounts. For example, Georgia Power, typically it's a negotiated 4%. Cable, under federal law, the fee can be up to 5%. Atlanta Gas Light, another example, it's a more complicated fee based on the dedicated design day capacity charge. They do kind of vary. There are other utilities. If a city provides service to another city, then that receiving city will charge a franchise fee. Often they'll enter into a franchise agreement and negotiate that fee. We've gotten some questions about how the rates of a regulated utility are set. And Georgia Power is really the easiest one to explain, so I'll just go with that one if that's all right with y'all. The rates are, of course, set by the Public Service Commission. With the Georgia Power rate, there's a one-bucket design, which means that all the costs of providing services really just go into one bucket and are split based on the customer. So they're pretty much divided out equally among customer usage. It's really a historical method for setting the rates. The franchise fee, by the way, goes back to, I think, the 1940s. We have agreements existing from way back then. Georgia Power and cities determined that it would benefit both of them to partner for economic development. As cities grew, Georgia Power's customer base grew. Having more people in having denser areas to serve increase the rate of return for Georgia Power and decreases the average cost to serve because it does cost more to serve in more rural, less populous areas. The franchise fee, some of the questions that have been raised is why it's included in the one bucket design. It goes along with a lot of the other costs, which I'll get back to in a second, but part of the importance of the one bucket design is that when businesses look at Georgia as a place to locate, there's one rate that applies to everybody. And they don't have to look from one county to the next county and see what the different rates are going to be from one to the other. If that were to change now, I'm not really sure what would happen. It could push businesses out of cities. They might leave the state. It's really tough to say. It definitely benefits smaller communities in unincorporated areas by keeping their rates low, because again, the more densely populated areas do subsidize the cost to serve in your less densely populated areas. There's a rate making issue on this now. It's at the PSC. There's a hearing set for November 8th. If y'all want to get a whole lot of information, that might be a good time to sit through a PSC hearing. So far, the cost to serve specific areas or specific customers has not been an issue with the rate making. It could be in the future, but at this point in time, it has not been, and right now everyone pays the same rate regardless of the cost to serve them and the benefits that they actually receive. And expenses are different around the state due to different transformers, substations, meter reading costs. It really just varies around the state depending on what's needed to serve an area. Key components of the rate, I've touched on some of them a little. The cost to serve, and that does include the purchase of property in unincorporated areas to run distribution lines. That's something that we all pay for. The rate of return is something that's considered really universally instead of just the rate of setting rates based on the rate of return from one location to another. Economic development costs are paid for by everybody, although efforts might be more focused in certain areas of the state than others depending on the year. Customer service costs are paid for by everyone. Transmission costs, one thing about that, we have learned that Georgia Power, and I'm sure that other utilities see this too, is going to spend several billions of dollars on a transmission line in North Georgia over the next few years. So that's something that we all pay for the same. And then property taxes is another thing that even though property taxes in some counties are higher than others, everybody pays equally because they're all part of that one bucket rate. And then we gotten some questions too about franchise agreements for non-utilities. And these are agreements that cities will have, and counties may too, but I don't know. They have them particularly with companies to pick up garbage or solid waste, or perhaps for septic services. And they're usually just contracts kind of to privatize a service instead of the city actually having the garbage trucks and hiring the employees to go out and provide a service. They contract with another company to do it. These can be exclusive. There are some cities that have exclusive agreements. Gainesville is an example of a city that does not have exclusive agreements. There are pros and cons to each, and so each city kind of goes on its own to decide. The city of Sewanee actually is in the process of deciding right now whether it should go from having multiple solid waste collectors to just having a single provider. And they actually are forming a citizens group called Waste Watchers to look through the pros and cons of that before making a decision. Did you want to?
Let me just add one thing on that. In Gainesville, we provide solid waste service to all of our residential homes, and then for commercial, multifamily, those are all provided by various private sector vendors. And as Gwen said, we do not have any type of exclusive arrangement with any of those vendors. There are certain standards in our code that they have to meet regarding insurance and liability, and then there is a franchise fee that each pays, and it's the same for each one. It's 5%, and it's collected by the city to help with some of the costs we have in administering a solid waste program in the city of Gainesville. I can answer more questions later about those. But I did also want to point out, when we talk about franchise fees for municipalities, that's an extremely important source of revenue. It does help offset significant costs that we have in the city to maintain our roads, maintain our rights of way, and it represents about, in our particular budget, about 12% of our general fund revenue that we receive each year.
The next topic we touched on a lot in Griffin is the fine add-ons, and because know y'all are looking for solutions. Our suggested solution to the fine add-on issue is a 35 to 50% add-on distributed pro rata. The reason for that range in there is because it really depends on what fines are included in that flat percentage. If you include all the retirement add-ons and some of the others, then it might be a little bit higher. But there is an issue right now that cities and counties both have, where they're the collection agencies for certain fine add-on beneficiaries and have to fully pay the fine add-on to those beneficiaries before they even get their underlying fine. And that is, it's something that's becoming a bigger deal. It's a bigger deal in some places than others probably.
Yes, in our court system, we handle a tremendous volume of court cases in Gainesville, and it's not only the number of fine add-ons, they're not all uniform. In other words, some apply to certain offenses, some apply to others, some are percentage-based, some are dollar-based, and with caps on if they're percentage, they're caps on the dollar amount. So just the pure administration of that is somewhat challenging. I feel in our community, we benefit from a computerized system that helps with that, and we have a portion of the fee that goes to offset the cost of that. But in a lot of smaller communities that don't have the ability to do that or don't have the volume of cases to justify that, it is a complicated process.
The next item, kind of to bring things full circle, at the first meeting, someone brought up the issue of tax allocation districts and QBE. And this has to do with the redevelopment powers law, in which local governments are authorized to issue bonds for certain redevelopment projects. And the increment, which is the millage rate applied to the increase in assessed value of the property, is the revenue from that is set aside to pay off those bonds. And apparently what's happening is that the QBE formula applies the 5 mils to the full assessed value instead of just the assessed value at the beginning of the project, and that is causing an equity issue for schools. I think they're having a hard time dealing with that because they're collecting their property taxes based on the initial assessed value instead of the current assessed value, but paying for doing the QBE on the current. And even though it's not as much an equity issue for cities, it is becoming a redevelopment issue because we are seeing schools, particularly in some cities in Cobb County, the school system is reluctant to participate in some of the redevelopment projects there because of this issue. This really just came to our attention in the last week or so.
Mr. Chairman, is it possible to go into this? Or I think you're going to offer a comment to Ms.
Do you have a question that you want to ask her? Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I guess I'll put it in a question. Did we not cure this with the legislation that passed last spring and allowed pilots payments in lieu of taxes, so that now the entity that puts together, if it be Cobb County, and they're asking the city of Marietta and the Marietta school system or another place in Cobb County, they can now, if they're the entity putting together the tax allocation district, as part of the agreement with the 3 people, they can enter into that agreement where pilots are paid to make up the difference between the 5% of the initial project cost and what QBE is counting. That was one of the very reasons that we passed the new bill that allowed for pilots.
My understanding, and this comes from Marietta and Smyrna specifically, is that the bill last year helped the large projects in the city of Atlanta. If the projects are really big and there's a lot of money coming in, then the city can afford to do the pilot. But if it's a smaller project, then it doesn't, I guess it doesn't go far enough to closing that gap for the city. The city just doesn't have the resources to make the ends meet if it's smaller. And I'll be glad to.
Well, I mean, the law allows the city to do that. It's just whether the project itself can bear the cost that is incurred by the Board of Education.
Right, and in the case in Smyrna, they were talking about one project that was about $130 million project, and they said that it wasn't going to be, what they were going to get from that was not going to be sufficient for them to be able to utilize the amendments that you made last year.
Well, they can utilize them, it's just the funds that are there aren't going to be enough to pay the pilots.
Right.
Okay.
Just a couple more things and then I'll be finished. Because this was about tax equity, I just wanted to mention a couple of recent things that some of our city folks have brought to us. One of them was brought to us recently, but it's an age-old thing, and that's an issue of double taxation, where the cities say that city residents are still paying for services that they do not receive from counties. One example that was given for that was planning and zoning, in that that's paid for in the general millage rate, but it's only county planning and zoning is only done in the unincorporated area. And then another issue that does still come up relates to the sheriffs and paying for the sheriff's patrol when the sheriff's patrol less in cities than in unincorporated areas.
Right, and I just wanted to relay one example of that, the change in law, how it affected Gainesville. Our city taxpayers were receiving under our prior service tax equity agreement about $1 million credit from Hall County government. When the sheriff's patrol portion was removed from the law, that reduced our current equity payment of $200,000. So that's where the biggest effect in the tax equity agreement was in the sheriff's area. So it's a very small amount now. So in our county has a tax levy of $40 million. Our city taxpayers pay 22% of that, and our tax equity credit is $200,000. So there doesn't seem to be the equity that the law suggests might exist.
And then the final thing relates to the insurance premium tax, and the state law requires the counties use their portion of the insurance premium tax to pay for services provided to unincorporated residents or to roll back ad valorem taxes to unincorporated areas. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen correctly. What I'm saying is that there is confusion. There are cities out there who aren't sure when they see a different millage rate in the unincorporated area, lower millage rate, county millage rate there than is applied in the city. They're not really sure why that happens, and they are having trouble getting the numbers to back up that difference in millage rate from the counties. And so we would like to see some provision requiring counties to provide that information to the city so that the cities can explain to their residents why there's a different millage rate.
Any questions from members on the committee?
Back to the franchise rates. The theme of this meeting is fairness and equity, and I just would like to hear your comment on the fact that the franchise fees are reserved only to cities and not counties, yet counties have right-of-ways, they have expenses for maintaining right-of-ways. They have all the same infrastructural needs, maybe in a lesser degree, typically in a bigger geography than the city. How do you condone the fairness of that?
Actually, we have a policy position saying that GMA does not oppose access of counties to franchise fees for payment for the rental of the right-of-way, as long as it doesn't reduce the amount of franchise fees that cities currently get. But certainly in places like DeKalb County and Fulton County, there's a good argument for counties to get franchise fees for the use of the right-of-way there.
Any other questions? I had a couple of questions. Franchise fee, let's say that whatever year agreement, let's say 25-year agreement is up with the city on a franchise fee, and the renegotiation process takes place, and let's just say utility company, an agreement cannot be reached. What happens at that point?
Typically, what we've seen, typically what we've seen there is that either the city's kind of got two choices, because they really, I guess there kind of is a fundamental problem with allowing a private entity to use a public right-of-way for free. So typically what will happen there is the city will impose a gross receipts tax, which is what happened in, I mentioned that Supreme Court ruling earlier. It was from, I think, Calhoun, Georgia. And the city couldn't get the EMC to enter into a franchise agreement with the city or to renew its franchise agreement. And so they tried to go ahead and impose the franchise fee. The court said, no, you can't do that. There's no agreement, therefore no franchise fee. So the court then instituted or adopted a gross receipts tax that by ordinance, and so ended up charging a gross receipts tax to the utility, which the court did uphold. So that's what would happen. We typically, the only entities that I'm aware of that's been an issue with are the EMCs. Georgia Power has been a very willing partner in working on franchise agreements. because there is a reciprocal benefit to that. Atlanta Gas Light's the same. I'm not trying to disparage the EMCs, but their situation is a lot different. They're a lot more rural. The cable companies have been pretty good. Bell South actually has opted not to enter into franchise agreements of late, and so there's a 3% gross receipts tax that cities impose on Bell South, and it's a line item on the bill, I believe. The other alternative would be to tell the utility to get all of its facilities out of the municipal right-of-way and have them purchase private property to run their facilities across.
And have special election.
I have a small business in the city of Gainesville, great city, by the way. And Brian, appreciate you joining us. I pay it's a small amount, maybe $12, $15 a month franchise fee each month on my dumpster bill. And could you explain what that goes to?
Well, that is the franchise fee that I referred to earlier, that any commercial solid waste provider in the city must be licensed by the city and pay a franchise fee of 5% of their gross revenues. So that's the fee that they are paying. That in our city, that equates to about $100,000 that we collect citywide for us to support a solid waste program that's in excess of $2 million. So it helps to defray the cost of that overall operation. And it also, I think, recognizes the fact that there are issues associated with that type of business that create wear and tear on streets, that do damage on occasion, not all, but to, say, driveway aprons coming in off streets that are city responsibilities, that create added litter when there's spills, which there are periodically, that when the hauler is gone, the city is left there to clean up. So the fee helps to recognize and offset some of those costs that we experience.
Okay. Any other questions? Representative Martin.
If I could follow up on the chairman's question to the city manager. I could question, having been in city government, and we don't charge franchise fees to concrete trucks, and they do heavy damage on roads. The state taxes them, and the county taxes them for those in other places. So I differ from you there. I will ask you this, though. Do you use that money that the chairman pays and other businesses in Gainesville pay? Is that part of what you use to offset the cost of preparing this reports that we require you at the state to prove the 20 or 25% waste reduction stream? I mean,
that's an expense.
Because that's what I thought it was supposed to go to.
Well, that's an expense. That's an expense towards our in our solid waste department. So certainly that is something that we would use all revenues that we receive, but it's not going to be segregated in our budget. This comes from that and pays for that, because it's we talked about with the franchise and Georgia Power's kind of one bucket.
But that is something that the state still requires a reduction. You to show a reduction in your city's income stream through your private and residential homes as well as the business.
That's correct, and we have to participate in a solid waste plan that we do in combination with our county government and other municipalities in our county.
All right. Well, thank you, Gwen and Brian, for coming today.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to our next presenter. At this time, we'll ask Kelly McCutcheon to come, who's Executive Vice President of Georgia Public Policy Foundation, and his comments on budget and spending.
Well, thank you very much. I had a presentation, but the projector you have is not big enough for it, so I got a little 3-page handout instead. And in light of time, I'm not going to read this, but just make a few comments. I think in looking at revenue structure, I think one thing we've got to keep our eyes on is something that's been our friend and been very good for Georgia, and that's growth. Economic growth hides a lot of flaws. And I think the first concern would be, do no harm. Let's make sure we don't do anything to harm the attractiveness of our state for industry and jobs, and the best thing we can do for low-income individuals, give them opportunities for good jobs, and it also provides a steady revenue stream for us. It makes everyone's jobs easier compared to states that have somewhat stagnated, like Ohio or Michigan, for instance. Economist Richard Vedder of Ohio University has done a lot of research in this area, which taxes hinder growth the most. And what he found is that by far the personal income tax is the most destructive to growth, followed next by the property tax, and sales tax is the least destructive for growth. So it's something to keep in mind. And although we complain about it, if you relative to other states, Georgia's per capita property taxes, state and local, are 34th highest So we're still relatively low. Our sales taxes are 24th highest in the country, and our personal income tax 19th highest. So we are a little high on the personal income tax. One of the key things to keep in mind are also principles, and I've given you some principles of tax reform there. An important one is having a broad base and a low rate, wherever possible. And I think we talked about that today, eliminating exemptions. I think for fairness and equity, we need to make sure that there's a lot of thought that goes in to any exemption that we have, and there's a lot of support when we do that. And one I'd like to talk about today, where there is much support, is not taxing business inputs. Noted a well-respected editor of State Tax Notes, David Renori, has said, when a business purchases a product or service, it should not pay tax on the purchase. There is near unanimity among public finance scholars on this issue. The sales tax is supposed to be imposed on the final consumer. And I think that's an issue, a short-term issue we have in our state, is we're applying sales tax on energy used in manufacturing. I know you've heard a lot about that, but we do very much believe that is, in principle, something that should not happen, and relative to other states damages our competitiveness. So just wanted to make that note. Second, I've been asked to address property tax reductions, property tax freezes. I know Dave Shoquist of Georgia State University has looked at this issue and some studies, and he's noted that in general that it's not been effective in what he has shown in reducing property tax levels. You talk about healthcare a lot, of balloon analogy, where you poke in over here and it just goes out over here. And I think that's appropriate. We have to be very careful with property tax and local government finances in general. Each group likes to complain that if we give one group a reduction, if you're not careful, then all that is going to do is put pressure somewhere else, whether it's on agricultural property, forestry, as we've heard today, or on business. So I think we've to be very careful about that, and I think that the University of Georgia economist Jeff Dorfman had a very good comment on this. He wrote an article recently. He said, instead of concocting complicated systems of awarding tax breaks to favored classes of citizens, let's limit government spending. Instead of capping increases in assessed values, cap increases in state and local government spending. And as you may know, we are very much a fan of more transparency in state and local government, and a state and local spending cap, which could be voted on or a supermajority requirement to exceed, would bring that transparency back. How many times in a local government have you passed a sales tax to roll back millage rates, and then 5 or 10 years later you notice that the millage rates have crept back up? That may well be unfunded mandates that the local government is providing, and they don't really have a choice, but we think there needs to be more transparency, and that's something that deserves a lot of attention. One last thing I can't resist, and going a little at the end, there are a few comments they made I would like to comment on earlier. On the estate tax, I think that was a very poor decision for us to adopt the state tax after it's going away. I think if Mr. Gates and Mr. Buffett would like to pay state taxes, we could make an adjustment for them. On the tobacco tax, we did not support that increase a few years ago. We would not support that again. Applying that to Medicaid, I think, is tenuous. You look at an example like New York State that has a very high cigarette tax, and they also are spending some of the highest amounts of money on Medicaid of any state in the country. Besides that, we're picking winners and losers, and there again, fairness and equity. I don't think we should pick winners and losers. That allows us to, people that, nanny status, to get in control. We've set that precedent. What's going to become next? Obesity is a health problem in Georgia. Are they going to start putting a tax on soft drinks or fast food or my personal favorite, ice cream? I think I'd be very careful before we go down that road. And finally, on income tax, I think raising the income tax from 6% to 7% would be one of the worst things we could possibly do if I had to choose the worst of all. In fact, I'd like to see us go in the other direction because personal income tax is one of our higher taxes relative to other states. I'd like to see us, as a long-term goal, start to reduce our dependence on the personal income tax. The big picture, our big concern is Georgia, many years ago, was a low-tax state. The Tax Foundation, in its most recent rankings, ranked our tax burden 25th in the country. right in the middle. If that trend continues, we're going to move into higher and higher taxes, bigger and bigger government. I don't think that's Georgia, but I think we need to realize where the trend is going and pay attention to that. I think the tax and spending limit would go a long way to providing us insurance that that doesn't happen. And with that, I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Any questions, any members of the committee? All right. Kelly, thank you so much for that presentation. Our next presenter is Phil Henson, who has been recommended to come. Congressman Linder's office was contacted to come in regards to the Georgia fair tax, and he could not be here, and he has recommended Phil Henson today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to be here to speak with you today. I'm here on behalf of Americans for Fair Taxation, which is an organization dedicated to the passage of H.R./S25, the fair tax bill at the federal level, as well as the repeal of the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Although the fair tax proposal reforms our system of federal taxation, it is our belief that many states would benefit greatly from harmonizing their systems to the fair tax, either prior to or after the fair tax is implemented at the federal level. I would like to outline the overall design of the federal fair tax proposal and then discuss some issues related to its implementation at the state level. As the subject of this hearing is balance and fairness, I will specifically address that aspect of the proposal also. The fair tax was developed using methodology similar to that employed by Fortune 500 companies in developing a new product. Sophisticated market research techniques, including telephone surveys, focus groups, targeted advertising, and the measurement of hits on a website were used to determine what the American people wanted in the tax system. The organization went into the project with no predisposition toward any specific form of taxation or tax system design. They gave the development team, comprised largely of marketing professionals on loan from several Fortune 500 companies, as well as leading academic economists from Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Rice University, etc., carte blanche in designing a new tax system. They started with a simple premise that we as a nation could do better, much better than the confusing and horribly inefficient maze of often inconsistent special interest provisions that characterize our current tax system. It must be emphasized that the methodology bypassed the political system and developed an alternative to the current system which addressed the needs and desires of Americans of all types, wealthy and poor, liberal and conservative, young and old, black and white. The fair tax is a bipartisan proposal, even though some partisans have chosen to see it through that prism. The result of several years of research funded by approximately $20 million in private sector donations is an NRST, National Retail Sales Tax, levied on all sales to end-user consumers, which replaces all income taxes, both personal and corporate, capital gains taxes, payroll taxes, including Social Security and Medicare, and estate and gift taxes. Stated another way, the fair tax leaves excise taxes, which comprise approximately 5% of total federal revenues alone, and replaces all others. Several leading economists have estimated it to be revenue neutral at a tax-inclusive rate of approximately 23%. Therefore, when scored on a static basis, the fair tax raises roughly the same amount of revenue via an NRST that the taxes that it replaces raise collectively. However, because of the significant growth in the economy that the fair tax would ignite, it would raise more revenue if scored on a dynamic basis. The fair tax proposal provides a monthly rebate for each family which is equal to poverty level spending, is already defined by the Department of Health and Human Services, applicable to each family size times the tax rate. The rebate, which is pegged solely to family size, is a simple yet ingenious mechanism for ensuring that the fair tax is progressive. The net effect is that no family pays taxes on spending up to the poverty level, since the rebate offsets dollar for dollar all taxes paid at the checkout counter for consumption up to that poverty level. Because the fair taxes rebate constitutes a smaller and smaller percentage of consumption taxes paid as one moves up the economic ladder, the fair tax is progressive when measured against consumption. The effective tax rate for a consumer at the poverty level is 0.00%, while the overall effective rate for a consumer at twice the poverty level for his or her family is 11.5%, which is half the nominal rate of 23%. The fair tax addresses a number of economic challenges and deficiencies of the current system we face as a country, such as, number one, the upward spiral of increases in complexity and compliance costs of the current system. Number two, the trade deficit, which came in at $725 billion in 2005 and is on a path to reach $1 trillion by the end of this decade. Number 3, the looming insolvency of Social Security and Medicare. Number 4, the individual savings rate, which has dipped into negative territory in this country in the past 2 years. Number 5, the substantial federal budget deficit and the resulting associated interest costs. Number 6, the widely held view that the current system favors the wealthy who have the resources to hire professionals to manipulate it for their benefit and take advantage of the myriad of loopholes which are beyond the reach of the average taxpayer, totaling a whopping $945 billion in 2006. The insidious aspect of the current system in which taxes paid at each level of the supply chain get passed on to the next level via the pricing mechanism. Individuals as workers, shareholders, and consumers ultimately bear the burden of all taxes under any tax regime. The fair tax makes these taxes more visible to those who bear their incidence. Before I begin my remarks on the fair tax as it relates to state tax reform, I want to point out that I'm not an economist and I'm not qualified to discuss the sales tax rate, which would be required to replace the income taxes in Georgia or any other state, nor the more specific questions that may relate to converting Georgia's tax system to one similar to the fair tax. I am, however, quite conversant in the overall concepts behind implementing the fair tax at the state level. I'm happy to discuss that area. In addition, I want the committee to understand that Americans for Fair Taxation has on its paid staff Dr. Karen Walby, former state economist and senior tax policy analyst for the Florida Tax Reform and Budgeting Commission. She's highly respected in the field of state taxation and has done extensive research into the implementation of the fair tax at the state level. I would encourage the committee to communicate with Dr. Walby as they continue to work on the best approach to reforming Georgia's state tax system. Most states have a combination of income and sales taxes at the present time. Most state sales taxes tax goods and not services and attempt to reduce regressivity through exemptions rather than a rebate. Therefore, in order to harmonize most state tax systems with the fair tax, most states would implement the following changes. Number 1, conform their state's sales tax base to the fair tax base, resulting in a potential doubling of the tax base. Number 2, implement a rebate to ensure progressivity, poverty level consumption times the sales tax rate, rather than an exemption system. Number 3, use the revenue gained from the expansion of the tax base to either reduce the state sales tax rate or reduce or replace other state taxes. Dr. Walby has found that many states can keep their sales tax rate the same and implement a fair tax-like system because adopting the fair tax base approximately double most state sales taxes. This may also offer an opportunity to address other problematic areas of state taxation, such as property taxation. The point is that the fair tax may be implemented at the state level without an increase in the sales tax rate, which makes it politically more viable than might be initially assumed. As it relates to balance and fairness, we strongly believe that the fair tax offers major benefits in this area. As previously described, the rebate is a simple yet effective way to ensure that the proposal is progressive. In addition, the fair tax eliminates payroll taxes as well as the embedded taxes paid by all consumers in their purchases, both of which are extremely regressive elements of the current system. One area of special concern related to balance and fairness is the growing problem with the illegal immigrant community. Much of the resentment arises from the fact that many illegals do not file income taxes nor have payroll taxes withheld from their paychecks, even though they do avail themselves of public services such as education, transportation, and health care. Under the fair tax, not only would illegals pay their fair share of sales taxes at the register, just as the rest of us do, but they would not receive the rebate. Only legal residents are eligible. Therefore, illegal immigrants would move from a tax preference position under the current system to one of a tax disadvantage under the fair tax. There are those who would criticize consumption taxes as unfair because they remove investment income from the tax base, and they point out that poor people use a greater proportion of their income for consumption than do higher income individuals. Most serious economists today are very concerned about our historically low savings rate. This results from a tax system which provides a disincentive to work and punishes savings and investment. Dr. Lawrence Kotlikoff of Boston University just completed a study on effective marginal and average lifetime tax rates under the fair tax versus the current system for various income groups. His findings were that all income groups enjoyed benefits under the fair tax, with the poor receiving the greatest relative benefits, middle-class Americans next, and those at the high end of the economic ladder receiving the least, even though they're still positive. Americans for Fair Taxation will be happy to provide any interested committee members with copies of this research. One additional point for the committee's consideration is the level of support for the fair tax among Georgia voters and consumers. Primarily because of Representative John Linder, Republican from Georgia's 7th Congressional District, and talk show host Neil Bortz, Georgia has more fair tax support than any other state in the country by a wide margin. During the Georgia primaries held this past July, the fair tax was a referendum item on the Republican ballots in 3 counties, Cobb, Gwinnett, and Fayette. The fair tax received favorable votes from 85 to 87% of those voters in all 3 counties. While we concede that those results would not be consistent with what one would expect outside the greater Atlanta metro area, nor on Democratic ballots at the present time, we do believe that it demonstrates the level of support which can be achieved in a populace which has been exposed to the concept for some time and has had an opportunity to have their questions answered. One additional point I want to make has to do with the stability of the revenues, which is often a concern about switching to an all-sales tax system. We have a graph that shows the level of consumption in this country from the early 1900s until the present time, and the graph is basically from left to right, an upward sloping curve showing one dip in 1933. That's the only time in the last 80 to 90 years that there's been a year-over-year drop in consumption in this country, despite the economic ups and downs that we've experienced in the interim period of time. So for those people who suggest that we switch with income tax, that we stay with income taxes as a buffer against economic volatility, the facts suggest that just the opposite is the case. I am happy to take any questions that the committee might have.
Any questions, Mr. Chairman?
I have a couple. Back to your formula for, I understand 23% federal level. What did you say would be the percentage at the state level?
I don't know that. That would have to require some number crunching on the part of Dr. Waldy. I can't address specifics as far as Georgia was concerned.
There would need to be a corresponding rebate as well at the state level.
Right, and it would be basically the poverty level times whatever the sales tax rate would be.
We heard testimony here from several pretty smart folks earlier, economist types and so forth, that one of the major reasons that the state of Georgia enjoys a AAA bond rating for its financial security, so to speak, or creditworthiness is because of the diversity in our tax code. We would lose all diversity. How would the fair tax stack up as far as in the eyes of those folks that would rate us as far as a stability factor, in your opinion?
Well, Mr. O'Neill, I can't address that specifically because, quite frankly, that's the first time this has come up when I was sitting here listening to the testimony today. I think we need to go back and address that. I believe, as I indicated earlier, that the fact that consumption is such a stable revenue base, I think that would go a long way toward offsetting that concern. But it would take some economists to probably address that better than I can.
If that happens, I'd love to see it. That'd be very interesting. I've read Mr. Bortz's book. It's a very interesting concept.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Representative Tillman.
You know, the proposal is basically, it's an inclusive tax, you know, and we basically have an add-on tax. Would the bill come where you would make the Georgia tax inclusive too, and they'd be taken at the same time?
Well, there's a little bit. I think there's a little bit of confusing terminology. I think when the intent is that the sales tax be broken out separately on the receipt so that everyone see it. One of the advantages we feel that the fair tax has is its visibility. The people who are bearing the tax burden see it, as opposed to the current system where much of the tax burden that we bear as consumers is buried in the price of our consumable items, because the various steps along the supply chain are the ones that are writing the checks, but we end up bearing the tax burden. So I don't know. That would be a matter that the Georgia legislature would take up the specifics of whether it be considered inclusive or exclusive.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hanson.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. It's been talked about a lot throughout the state, and this committee today is trying to hear from all different areas. So our next presenter is Lee Hughes and Daniel Russo from who's Director of Tax Policy at Gulfstream Aerospace Corporation. And so if you would come at this time, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a one-page handout that you should have received earlier, which contains some topics that I want to talk about, and also the draft legislation which we're seeking. And if you could just simply stamp it passed, I'd be happy to sit down and keep the meeting moving along. Gulfstream has been part of the Georgia community for almost 40 years, moving down here from Bethpage, New York in 1967. It's the largest employer in Chatham County, based in Savannah. Gulfstream manufactures business aircraft. Gulfstream has enjoyed good economic success over its time in Georgia, ups and downs, just like any other business. The number of Gulfstream aircraft that are currently flying in the air, the fleet size has doubled over the last 10 years. Gulfstream Georgia employment levels. Gulfstream currently employs 5,000 people between Savannah and Brunswick, Georgia. Close to an additional 1,000 workers are temporary or job shoppers, so total employment in Georgia, 6,000 people. Georgia has been the primary headquarters of Gulfstream Aerospace Corporation since it moved to Savannah. We recently announced a major facility expansion, the largest in the company's history, where we pledged to add a minimum of 1,100 new jobs through 2011. We're also working with the local communities and colleges, in addition to Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia, to provide local training programs. There's been announced an airframe and power school that's going to be built in Savannah. So there's a lot of training of the Georgia citizens to try and generate a workforce that can be drawn from here in Georgia. In terms of dollars, Gulfstream is going to invest a minimum of $300 million in new and renovated facilities through 2011. And the legislation which I'm here to talk about today deals with our aircraft service center business, and the projection is to double that in size from the current. We have a current service center in Georgia, which is approximately the 4th largest non-commercial business service center in the world for business aviation aircraft. And we're proposing to double that in size, consistent with the fleet, our fleet doubling in size. But one of the disadvantages to doing that here in Georgia is that there is currently a sales tax on aircraft parts when sold to the aircraft owner. There are currently 15 to 20 states that either have or are considering an exemption on aircraft parts, and because an aircraft is a movable piece of property, they can fly it anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world to get it fixed, to get a part, to get it repaired or whatever. So it's a if you will, a national problem. It's not a sort of a southeast problem. And so one of the things that we're looking to do is to pass this legislation, because Gulfstream is at a competitive disadvantage in this regard. And I will, neighboring states such as Florida have no tax on aircraft parts. Over 60% of Gulfstream's workforce is in Georgia. These are good-paying, high-paying jobs. Doubling the size of the service center is a win-win for the state and for the community. Georgia also, in addition to its payroll, which is currently in excess of $300 million a year, pays over $55 million a year now to Georgia company suppliers. All of this is going to increase with the employment levels increasing and with the facility expansion that we're talking about. Gulfstream is a big part of the Georgia economic community. And so what we're asking for here is a sort of a level playing field with other states that have this aircraft parts exemption. And even within Georgia, this legislation that we're proposing to exempt these aircraft parts, we're actually asking to be put on what I call a level playing field with other aerospace companies. Commercial aircraft carriers such as Delta, there's an exemption for aircraft repair parts when it comes to commercial common carrier planes. There's also an aircraft parts exemption for government planes. The U.S. government not subject to tax, so the Lockheed Martins of the world don't have to worry about this. So really we're trying to, there are already exemptions in the law for other aerospace industries in Georgia, and we're just trying to, if you will, bring it up to par with the rest of that. As I've said, the proposed legislation is on your handout. We tried to keep it as brief as possible. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions from members of the committee?
I got a question. How much would that cost?
We estimate that it would be between $2 and $3 million a year. I mean, we're the largest service center. Like I said, we're the fourth largest, non-commercial service center in the world. We collect roughly between $1.8 and $2 million a year in sales tax. So I would say the rest of Georgia, $1 million. I'm probably being conservative. It's probably not that much.
Thank you.
Representative Martin.
I don't think your bill's in the proper form to be voted on today, Mr. Chairman. No, but seriously speaking, I just wanted to pose this question to you, and it relates to something that the folks from Georgia State shared with us earlier when we talked about all these carve-outs and exemptions. You say it's going to cost them, potentially cost $1 million. It may cost $2 million. But that's revenue we may not get if we don't have it. Is that not true?
That is true. And
let me just finish. I'm just trying to capture it. If we don't do this, we may not get that business done in Georgia, and those people may not earn that income in Georgia and may not pay those income tax in Georgia. And that is true in what you're thinking. You're talking about incremental revenue that we don't have, that we would lose, but we may not get.
Yes.
If going all around the world. And I wonder, going back to the Georgia State examples that showed us earlier of those exemptions of revenue that we're not getting, I wonder how much of that business wouldn't be being transacted in Georgia were it not for the exemption that might have brought it in. So, and they said in their presentation that some of the exemptions are valid and useful, and this may be one. So I just wanted to use that to make a point.
No, I think it's an excellent point. And I think one of the things that they mentioned was that there are exemptions that are used to spur economic development. And I think that this exemption is to spur economic development. And let me just give you a couple of factoids. When a plane comes into our service center, it spends an average of 5 to 10 days. So when the plane comes there, the people who fly it in, the pilots, the customer who's ever on the plane, are spending 5 to 10 days in downtown Savannah or the surrounding area at hotels, at restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. We've had a lot of customers, people like Savannah, they come down, they bring the plane there, they come back with their family next time. So there's some tourism dollars and revenue dollars there. There's also an incremental, if you will, income tax upside, because the more revenue we generate in Georgia, even with the single sales factor apportionment, the more Georgia income tax we're going to pay. So it's really to generate more business, generate more payroll, and put the tax dollars back in the community and the state, if you will, in other ways. And the legislation that we're proposing is a quote-unquote flyaway exemption, meaning, if Home Depot owns an airplane, they're going to pay the tax because they're here in Georgia and they'd be paying the use tax anyway. And so it's very similar to a lot of other states that have a similar exemption.
Ma'am, do we have time for one quick
Yes.
follow-up, Mr. Isn't it true the same thing as if we charge the fuel tax on a jet airplane that you service down there, and that we charge fuel tax on it when that plane takes off to fly back to England, if that's where it's based, they can actually apply for a rebate on that tax?
On the fuel tax?
On the fuel tax. I believe exported fuel tax, it's not going from state to state, but if it goes across country.
That's an excise tax question. I'm not sure about that. I know, if you take a trip to England and you pay value-added tax over there and it's on certain products, because you're living over there, when you return, you can apply for a refund. Okay. It may work in a similar fashion, but I don't know off the top of my head.
All right. Representative Roy?
These 1,100 new jobs, is that contingent upon you being able to get this sales tax exemption?
It is not. No, but it
would.
would.
Thinking about the individual income tax they're going to pay.
Yeah, no, but doubling the size of the service center, part of it will be contingent on the level of business that we can keep, and therefore the level of people that we need to employ. And this is certainly a hindrance in getting business into the service center.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to try to keep us moving along here. Our next presenter is Dwayne Brocksterman, who's Vice President of the Heart of Georgia Railroad Company, and also Sharon Dunn, who's also with the Georgia Railroad Association.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. You've got 3 handouts in front of you. One is just the Georgia state statistics for railroads in Georgia. The other is kind of an overview of revenues, capital expenditures as percentage of revenues. The other is what I'm going to present off of, and I am going to tell most of this story because I really think it's important that the railroad story needs to be told. I don't think it's told enough. As I said, my name is Dwayne Brocksterman. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Heart of Georgia Railroad in Americus, Georgia. and we operate from Vidalia to Mart, Alabama, from Midville to Vidalia, and then we also have the Georgia Midland Railroad, which operates from Dover to Metter, Sylvania to Ardmore, and in addition, Fort Valley to Perry. I'm here to speak to you today as President of Georgia Railroad Association. GRA consists of 18 short-line railroads and 2 Class 1s, namely CSX and Norfolk Southern, serving communities throughout the state on approximately 5,000 miles of track. I'd like to thank you for allowing me to address the committee and ask for your consideration in a tax reform measure that we believe would lead to a safer, more efficient, more expansive railroad industry in Georgia. Railroads play an important role in everyday life of Georgians, whether it be an automobile we drive, the homes we live in, the appliances we use. Freight rail brings nearly 130 million tons of freight to and through Georgia every year. In the future, they will need to become an even more important part of this role due to air pollution and traffic congestion. Every boxcar you see on the railroad means 3 to 4 less trucks on the highway. Railroads are also critical to the state's economy. Their role should be increasing over the years. According to one study, even moderate economic growth suggests 57% overall freight tonnage in the next 15 years nationwide. Currently, about 16% of the freight tonnage goes by rail. If that percentage does not increase substantially as freight rail shipments increase, Georgia and the nation will face tremendous problems with air pollution, congestion, not to mention increased costs for road and bridge maintenance on our highway system. If railroads are to meet their potential for our future economy, many improvements in infrastructure will be needed. Many of the tracks and bridges over which short lines operate, such as ourselves, are inadequate to handle the newer 286,000-pound and the coming 315,000-pound cars. As a matter of fact, a recent study from the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials in their bottom line report, I quote, "If improvements are not made in the freight rail system, the nation's freight transportation system will weaken, and shippers, highway users, communities will pay the social, economic, and environmental costs of that." As presented to you, an enclosed press release shows that railroads are one of the nation's most capital-intensive businesses. On an average, investing 17% of their total revenue back in infrastructure, compared with about 3.7% invested by the average U.S. manufacturer. But even with this record level of investment, we can't add enough infrastructure fast enough to maintain long-term market share. And that includes investing well over $100 million by CSX, NS, and the short lines in 2005 alone in Georgia. It seems clear that encouraging the use of rail transportation would be in the public interest. State tax equity is critical and necessary to the ability of Georgia's railroads to compete on a level playing field with other transportation modes. One needed change in public policy would be to eliminate the 4% sales tax on diesel fuel. Of the 4% fuel tax paid by our competitors, the trucking industry, 3% goes directly into the DOT highway fund to mainly basically fix bridges and roads on which they run. The 4% paid by the railroad industry goes into the general fund, of which the industry receives no direct benefit for freight rail infrastructure. Revenue impact to the state, which by our estimations would approach $14 million, around that neighborhood, that pales in comparison to the nearly $482 million in total wages paid to the state's 8,000 freight rail employees. And with the previously mentioned high cost of capital required to operate our industry's rail network, these funds saved from an exemption would go back into the infrastructure. As for this tax, as it is applied to our neighboring states in the southeast, 3 do not have a diesel fuel tax: North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. And Florida is not really a sales tax, but it is a use tax, as I understand it, of some type. While a total exemption, we believe, is the most equitable way to address the issue, We understand that there are other alternatives that may be explored. Therefore, I would like to offer two. First one, maybe a cap on the sales tax on a cents per gallon basis, a set amount per gallon would stabilize our projections, give us a better idea how much we're going to be spending on that sales tax. Number two, the establishment of a dedicated freight rail maintenance program with the diesel fuel tax proceeds. Let's take what we're paying now, the 4%, dedicated to a maintenance program that all railroads could apply for infrastructure improvements. The state of Georgia, as you all know, remains the fastest state and one of the fastest growing states in the nation. People who currently and future live in Georgia rely day to day on many of the products shipped over Georgia's vast rail network. It'd be vital to maintain this highly capital-intensive industry to effectively move these products. I thank you for your time. Try to be brief. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I also have, if they get too technical for this operating guy, I have Mr. McFadden with Norfolk Southern here that could help.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? All right. Well, the railroad industry is certainly important to Georgia. Thank you so much for sharing that. All right. Our next presenter is Elton Maddox, who's president of Wayne Farms. And I know those of you that are here at the end, you've been waiting a long time, and I appreciate your patience.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you have my handout already. If you don't, that's what I'll be speaking from. Copy for everyone. First, let me thank the chairman, committee members for allowing me this opportunity to speak about a very important subject and to express my support for legislation that would provide relief from sales tax on energy used in manufacturing and food processing. I'm Elton Maddox, President and CEO of Wayne Farms, LLC, headquartered in Oakwood, Georgia. We're one of the top 6 fully integrated poultry processors in the United States. We employ 10,000 people. We process over 250 million birds annually, or 1.5 billion pounds of ready-to-cook products annually. We do that in 13 locations or 13 facilities located in the Southeast. I'm also speaking today on behalf of the owners, CEOs, managers, and employees of over 40 poultry processing facilities in Georgia through the Georgia Poultry Federation, and also for employers who are members of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. Poultry industry is the leading segment of agriculture and agribusiness in Georgia and has an annual economic impact of over $14 billion, generating about $485 million in local and state sales tax each year. This is from a study by Georgia Tech recently. The jobs of nearly 100,000 Georgians depend on this industry. The poultry industry is a very competitive business. Competing in the domestic and global marketplaces, we depend on efficiencies at each step of production and strict cost controls to gain a competitive advantage. As with other manufacturing businesses, energy is a significant part of our bottom line overall cost. The dramatic rise in energy costs has had a significant impact on our bottom line. A typical poultry processing facility in the state might spend as much as $4.5 million annually on energy. This would require a sales tax obligation of approximately $300,000. And just to give you an idea of what we do in our own company, I went back and had our folks to look at the last 12 months of the facilities we have in Georgia. We have spent over $15 million on energy in the last 12 months, and that would probably require a tax obligation for us. I didn't get that number, of over $1 million to process in the state of Georgia. From a budgeting standpoint, this creates a situation where businesses like ours must try to predict not only the actual energy cost as it continues to rise, but also to budget the accompanying sales tax due. And I think it's very important that we remind ourselves that any business today using the same amount of energy that they were using prior to the spike up in natural gas cost is certainly paying a significant more in sales tax. Some might call that a windfall for the state, but whatever you call it, the tax is being paid by those same companies that are generating jobs and stimulating economic growth in the state. And somehow this just doesn't seem like a fair system of taxation. My company operates in 5 different states: Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, and Georgia. Other than Georgia, only one of those states do not provide some type of sales tax relief for energy costs. Our neighboring states of Tennessee, Florida, South Carolina all provide full exemption. Georgia's manufacturers and food processors face stiff competition in the global marketplace. The jobs of hard-working Georgians depend on whether these companies win or lose in the marketplace. But our competition doesn't come only from overseas. As most of you are fully aware, Georgia competes with other states for jobs and economic development opportunities, and we do that on a daily basis. As a CEO of a company with 10,000 people, I'm constantly called on to determine and make a decision as to where to deploy our corporate resources. Tax incentives, or the lack thereof, play a key role in our decision-making process, and I'll give you an example. In 2003, we were looking very seriously at building a new state-of-the-art further processing facility. Our first choice was Georgia. We looked at several sites in Georgia. We put together a package for that. However, when we came down to making a decision and looking at all of the incentives and other things, which included tax incentives, the site we chose was in Alabama. That facility, when completed, we will have spent over $140 million in construction costs. We will employ over 600 people. We will generate over $300 million in revenue out of that one facility each year. And we will produce over 120 million pounds of fully cooked, ready-to-eat products each year. To support that facility, we have to do a very similar expansion project with raw materials. And unfortunately, we're still being pulled in other directions today, other than the state of Georgia, as to where to make those investments. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to address this important issue before the committee. Georgia is a great place to grow and process chickens. We at Wayne Farms are very thankful to be in Georgia. That's why we have our corporate headquarters here. And we look to be a vital part of the growth in Georgia through both jobs and economic development. And we can only do that as we grow as a company and be a part of that. We have to constantly seek improvements and advantages. If we don't, our competition will be more than happy to take our place. Providing an exemption for sales tax on energy used in manufacturing is a reasonable step and one that will strengthen the position of the state's manufacturers. Georgia is the nation's leading poultry-producing state, and we hope to keep it that way for many, many years. On behalf of the Georgia poultry industry, I urge the General Assembly to consider favorably any proposal to exempt sales tax on energy used in manufacturing or food processing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maddox, and we certainly appreciate what Wayne Farms means to Oakwood, the town that I represent. Any questions from members of the committee? Representative Tumlin.
Mr. Maddox, when you use the word energy, what all are you talking about? Natural gas, gasoline? Or
energy extends out to natural gas, electricity, carbon dioxide, nitrogen. We use extensive amounts in our industry of carbon dioxide and nitrogen to freeze products with, so it goes beyond what we would typically think of in just being natural gas, propane, or electricity.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much for sharing that information with us. All right, our next presenter is Chris Clark with the Georgia Department of Economic Development. Is Chris here? All right. Well, count your blessings. Let me just say thank you for attending today. And before we wrap this up, our next meeting will be held by Representative Martin, and I'm sure that will be announced a date and a time later. And I want to thank Chairman Larry O'Neill for affording me this opportunity. And we've had a full agenda today. I appreciate the members staying steady at it. Mr. Chairman, any closing comments?
Appreciate you doing a great job, and appreciate being here in this wonderful Titus and county. It's a real treat.
Thank you. We'd remind the members of the committee that if you're attending dinner, Cindy Shepherd will have directions for you as we exit here. Cindy Shepherd or Joy Walsh. Thank you so much. We're dismissed.